The Earl's Christmas Songbird, written by Violet Sinclair, narrated by Isadora Blythe. Chapter 1. Snow sifted over Bond Street in soft, glittering veils, the sort of gentle December fall that made even the soot-darkened brickwork appear touched by grace. Phoebe Whitmore paused at the curb, breath trembling in the cold, her hands wrapped tightly around the shawl-swaddled bundle pressed to her chest. Her grandmother's final gift, now her family's last hope. She told herself she would walk inside with dignity. She told herself she would not cry. Neither promise felt sturdy. She pushed open the jeweler's door. The bell above it gave a small, startled chime. Warmth enveloped her at once, polished wood, brass oil lamps, the faint smell of beeswax and varnish. A regiment of clocks ticked along the far wall like the heartbeat of some mechanical creature. The proprietor did not look up immediately. He was the sort of man whose livelihood depended on listening, weighing footsteps, categorizing intent. The quick, confident tread of someone come to buy. He knew that sound well. But this, he heard slippered hesitation. A woman, alone, not a customer, but a supplicant. When he finally raised his gaze, he schooled his expression into polite neutrality. "Good afternoon, miss." His eyes flicked, as they all did, to the bundle she held. Phoebe lowered her hood and loosened the shawl, revealing her most precious possession. The little birdcage seemed to glow on its own, a gilt lattice of impossibly fine wire, curled into delicate Gothic arches and miniature turrets. At its center perched the automaton bird, golden-scaled, opal-crested, topaz-eyed. It looked heartbreakingly alive, the last connection to a grandmother she'd never met but whose legacy sustained her. The jeweler leaned closer, monocle clicking into place. "My word," he murmured, "an automaton of unusual workmanship." "It was my grandmother's," Phoebe said, her voice thinner than she wished. He nodded, attentive, assessing, calculating the value not only of the object but of the desperation beneath it. "And you wish to?" She drew a steadying breath. "Just ask. Just do it." The rent was due, her brother's school fees unpaid, and Christmas approaching with nothing to spare. "Pawn it," she managed. "For a month." His brows rose. "A month at Christmas?" A regretful cluck of the tongue. No, I move quickly this time of year. A week is all I can offer." Phoebe's stomach dropped as if the world had pitched sideways. "A week is impossible." "A week," he repeated, kindly but immovable. "Until the 24th at noon. After that, it must go into the window. No second chances." Her vision blurred for a heartbeat. She steadied herself. "Then wind it, please." He lifted the tiny gold key from her palm, warm already from her touch, and fitted it into the slot beneath the cage. 3 quiet turns, the bird stirred. Its little head lifted, turned left, then right, in that familiar, curious motion she had memorized from countless childhood viewings. A faint mechanical click signaled its throat engaging before sound emerged. Greensleeves. A bright, trembling thread of it, slightly flat on the final phrase, as it had always been, as if the bird reached for a note the world no longer granted. Phoebe's throat tightened. Though she had never met her grandmother, she could almost hear the woman's voice speaking the words from the letter that had accompanied the gift. Joy must be made, not inherited. The music faded. Silence rushed in. The jeweler cleared his throat gently. "The sum I can offer is," he named an amount that burned her cheeks. Too little for an automaton of such exquisite craftsmanship, too much for her pride to easily surrender. But pride had never kept her mother fed or paid for her brother's schooling, and with Christmas approaching, they needed every shilling she could gather. "I accept," she whispered. The pawn ticket slid across the counter, thin as a moth's wing. "Your name, miss?" "Whitmore." "1 week, Miss Whitmore." Phoebe wrapped the shawl around the now empty space where the bird had been, and stepped back into the cold. The door shut behind her with a soft click, like a lock turning on her grandmother's legacy. She did not look back. She had 1 week to redeem the bird. Somehow she would find a way. Snow dusted the brim of Elliot Hawthorne's hat as he and Simon Hargreaves stepped into Hale & Son Jewelers. The bell above the door chimed brightly as if eager to announce that gentlemen with coin to burn had arrived. At 31, the Earl of St. Ives cut an imposing figure, tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of aristocratic confidence that came from never having a door closed in his face. Heat enveloped them at once, beeswax polish, brass, and the faint mechanical tick of clocks lining the far wall. The proprietor straightened so quickly he nearly dropped his monocle. Simon looked amused. "Right then, Elliot. Let's get on with it. A Christmas token for Lady Clarissa before her mother begins embroidering the wedding linens." Elliot gave him a flat, suffering look. "Diamonds are out of the question. Obviously." Simon leaned over a gleaming case. "Unless you want to propose, or be murdered for not proposing." "Emeralds," Elliot mused, studying a pendant with professional disinterest. Lady Clarissa Penholm was exactly the kind of woman he ought to marry. Elegant, well-connected, and thoroughly predictable. The problem was that he knew it, she knew it, and worst of all, her ambitious mother knew it too. "Too passionate," Simon said. "She'll think you've developed a soul. Rubies? Are you mad she'll faint from expectation, or have her mother faint for her?" Elliot flicked his fingers dismissively. "Pearls?" "Fatherly," Simon groaned, "unless you wish to imply she needs moral instruction. Sapphires?" "Fidelity," Simon said pointedly. "The one thing you are not offering." Elliot sighed. "Then what is left?" "You want something delightful," Simon said, "but not so delightful that it might be mistaken for intent." "Yes, Elliot," Simon said gently, "you want a miracle." The proprietor, who had been listening with all the subtlety of a cat at a mouse hole, brightened. "My lord, if I may suggest, this brooch, a spray of diamonds arranged as snowdrops, very tasteful." "No," Elliot said, already bored. "Show me something unusual." "As you wish, my lord. I have a set of gold fobs," but Elliot wasn't listening. A glint behind the counter caught his attention. Gold, curved wire, something delicate. He stepped past the proprietor in a single smooth motion. Behind the counter, half hidden, sat a small gilt birdcage, its wires twisting into miniature turrets and arches like some whimsical architect's model. At the center perched a little golden automaton bird, opal-crested, topaz-eyed, gleaming softly under the lamp. Elliot stopped breathing for a moment. Such craftsmanship was rare, the sort of unique object that might actually distinguish itself among Clarissa's collection of predictable luxuries, beautiful enough to please, unusual enough to intrigue, yet not so valuable as to suggest serious intentions. "Well," Simon murmured behind him, "that's absurdly charming." "It's perfect," Elliot said quietly. The proprietor made a strangled noise. "My lord, that item, it is not for sale." Elliot raised one brow. "Not for sale? In a shop?" "It was pledged this morning, my lord. Pawned. The young lady insisted on a week. She seemed quite determined to redeem it." Elliot waved this away with elegant impatience. Most pawned items are never redeemed, no matter the owner's intentions. Having never faced true financial constraint, the desperate calculations behind such transactions were merely abstract concepts to him. Life rarely obliges sentiment. "I need it now, not after Christmas." The jeweler wrung his hands. "But I promised." "Wind it," Elliot said softly. "My lord." "Wind it." No one disobeyed that tone, not in London, not in Europe, possibly not in the known world. The jeweler fetched the tiny key with shaking hands and inserted it beneath the cage. One turn, 3. The bird stirred, its head lifted, tilting left, then right, just as a living creature might. A faint click. Then, music. Greensleeves, sweet and trembling, slightly off on the final note, as if the bird reached for something it could not quite remember. The sound hit Elliot low in the chest, a peculiar ache. Something in the melody caught him unawares, stirring emotions he couldn't immediately identify. Not quite nostalgia, not quite longing, a complex sensation he hadn't felt in years and couldn't properly name. It was unsettling. He swallowed it down. "I'll take it," he said, his tone making it clear this was a decision, not a request. "My lord, I truly cannot." £50. The sum slipped from his lips with the ease of a man who had never worried about the contents of his purse. The jeweler swayed. "It is not a matter of 75. He increased the offer with the casual confidence of a man who had never been denied what he wanted. "My lord, 100. Silence slapped over the room. Simon let out a low whistle. "Catch him quickly, sir, before he faints." The proprietor closed his eyes, defeated. "Very well, my lord." Elliot nodded once, satisfied. "Good man." Simon leaned in. "So, for Clarissa?" "Yes," Elliot said. "It's perfect, charming without seeming too significant. She'll appreciate its uniqueness. More importantly, the gift would maintain their current arrangement, polite attention without commitment. And for Madame Rossetti," Simon asked, referring to Elliot's opera singer mistress. "I've already purchased diamond earrings," Elliot replied. "She appreciates clarity in all matters, particularly gemstones." Simon grinned. "Ah, the simplicity of honest transactions." The jeweler wrapped the cage carefully, almost mournfully, and presented it. Elliot noticed the man's hands trembling slightly, but attributed it to the unexpectedly large sum changing hands. Elliot tucked the parcel beneath his arm with the casual ease of a man who'd never counted pennies in his life. Snow fluttered against his hair as he stepped back out into the lavender dusk, the wind cold against his cheek. He looked down at the parcel. Lady Clarissa would receive it with perfect gratitude, of course. She was nothing if not well schooled in the appropriate responses, yet he found himself oddly reluctant to part with the little bird whose music had stirred something unexpected within him. "Ridiculous," he muttered, quickening his steps toward Brook Street. £100 for a trinket was hardly worth noting. He'd lost more at cards without a second thought, but the persistent melody of Greensleeves lingered in his mind like an unanswered question. It was merely a mechanical novelty, yet something about its imperfect tune had caught him unawares. Tomorrow, it would be wrapped and delivered to Lady Clarissa with an appropriately cordial note. Another obligation discharged with precision. The wind picked up, driving snow into his face, and Elliot tucked the parcel more securely under his arm as he walked on. Chapter 2. 4 days had passed since Phoebe had left her grandmother's bird in the jeweler's care. Each morning, she'd awakened to the familiar sense of cold ashes in the grate and her mother's lavender soap, the two fragrances that marked every winter of her life. Frost feathered the inside of the window panes, delicate as lace. She lay on her narrow bed and watched her breath cloud the air, the pawn ticket no more than a blur on the little table beside her. She had placed it there the night before like a challenge. 3 days left. The ink on it might as well have read, "Work, or lose everything that ever belonged to you." In the adjoining room, her mother coughed and turned over. The faint creak of the bedstead made something twist low in Phoebe's chest. Her mother slept badly in winter. Perhaps, Phoebe sometimes thought, the chill of their unheated rooms reminded her too much of the drafty drawing rooms she'd once ruled. A baron's daughter with a pretty face and a head full of sonatas, before she'd run away with a music master and thrown it all away. And with that decision, she had unwittingly thrown away Phoebe's chance at a genteel life as well. She swung her feet to the floor. The boards were so cold, her toes curled hard enough to cramp. She welcomed the discomfort. It kept the fear from swallowing her. In the cracked bit of looking-glass above the washstand, she saw a pale, determined face, dark hair braided and pinned severely. No trace of the girl who had once believed that fairy stories might be true if one only loved hard enough. She tied the ribbon at her throat with fingers that shook but only a little, then slipped on her gloves and tucked the pawn ticket beneath the wrist of the right one, where it lay over her pulse like a brand. The birdcage was gone, but she was not. She snatched up her music portfolio and crept to the adjoining door, listening. Her mother muttered something in her sleep about idiots in powdered wigs and subsided. Phoebe smiled despite herself and eased the door more firmly shut. 3 days to gather the money, she murmured to the silence. We will manage it. She descended the narrow stairs, greeted the landlady's cat on the sill, and stepped out into the December morning. Snow had turned the street into a brightness that hurt the eyes. Her breath puffed white as she walked, the cold biting at the inside of her nose, her boots skating now and then over hidden ice. Costermongers called, a chimney sweep tramped past with his rods over his shoulder, and somewhere a church bell tolled the quarter hour. She clutched her music case tighter, mentally calculating the sum she needed. £10, 4 shillings, and 6 pence. An impossible amount for most people in her circle, a trifling sum for those who had never worried about tomorrow's bread. 3 days remaining, one precious bird to redeem, one chance to succeed. Mr. Lacey's house sat in a row of respectable dreariness. Brown brick facades, black doors, lace curtains grown dingy with coal smoke. The maid let Phoebe in after making her wait just long enough to remind her of her place. Miss Whitmore for Miss Lacey, Phoebe said with the little smile she saved for servants who looked as tired as she felt. The girl bobbed a curtsy and led her to the parlor. The pianoforte sulked along one wall, perpetually out of tune. Miss Lacey sat before it with her shoulders slumped and her feet turned in, looking like a rabbit about to be made to dance. "Good morning, Miss Lacey," Phoebe said brightly. "Shall we see if the scales remember us today?" The girl giggled. "They never like to." "Then we shall charm them." Phoebe laid the music out and took her place at the side. "Right hand alone first, slowly. We are not racing them, we are courting them." It was dreadful, of course. Miss Lacey missed notes with the kind of perseverance that would have made her a brilliant general if applied to tactics. But she tried, and she smiled, and she looked so grateful every time Phoebe praised a correct interval that Phoebe felt her own heart warm in spite of the worry gnawing at her belly. "You see," she said, when they had made it through an entire line without stumbling, "you have conquered that measure. Next week, the entire page will surrender." "Do you really think so?" the girl asked. "I know so." Phoebe tilted her head. "You have the most charming touch on the left hand. It would be a great tragedy if the world never heard it." Miss Lacey blushed, and Phoebe's conscience poked her. "You are buying affection with words," it said. "I am buying food with them too," she answered silently. "And yesterday's do not pay today's debts." When the lesson was finished, Mr. Lacey stumped in, waistcoat unbuttoned, hair standing on end. "Well, is she a prodigy yet?" he demanded. "She is progressing very well," Phoebe replied. "I believe you shall be proud of her at Christmas, sir." "Huh." He squinted at his daughter, who straightened as if a string had been pulled. "Well, if you say so, Miss Whitmore, you've more patience than I." He patted at his pockets. "How much do I owe you?" she told him. The number had been growing for weeks, each next time piling atop the last like snow on a roof. Saying it aloud made her throat tighten. To her astonishment, he did not argue. He went to the desk, dug about in a drawer, and came up with a purse. It clinked hearteningly. "All right then," he said, and counted the coins into her palm. "Just don't let her become one of those show-off pianists. I've no objection to music, but I'd like to hear myself think now and again." "I shall make no promises on that score," Phoebe said, smiling. "Some of us are born to be loud." Miss Lacey laughed, startled and delighted, and Phoebe thought of her brother Henry and how he had once banged away on every available surface when he was small. She swallowed the ache that rose at the thought and tucked the coins safely away. One payment received, £1, 8 shillings. Still so far to go, but a beginning. A small step closer to redeeming her grandmother's gift. The Vane house stood only 5 streets away and a world apart. Polished brass, spotless steps, windows gleaming behind lace and pride. Phoebe wiped her boots carefully and straightened her shoulders before knocking. The footman did not conceal his disdain when he took her cloak. She handed it over with practiced dignity, despite knowing that as a mere music teacher, she was granted entry to such elegant rooms only through her professional skills, not social standing. Mrs. Vane's drawing room smelled of lavender and starch and the faintest whiff of boiled beef. Lydia sat at the pianoforte, fingers poised as if she would rather be anywhere else in creation. "Begin with the scales, if you please," Phoebe said. "And remember, your wrists are not sacks of flour. A bit of lift." Lydia obeyed. It was marginally less dire than the previous week. By the time they reached a halting version of "God Rest Ye Merry Gentlemen," the girl's shoulders had unknotted, and she had even managed a small smile. "You see," Phoebe said, "you do have music in you." "I have a mother who wants music in me," Lydia replied. "That is not quite the same." Phoebe laughed quietly. "Very few of us play for ourselves entirely, but you may yet discover you like it." There was a pause. "Do you?" Lydia asked suddenly. Phoebe blinked. "Pardon?" "Like it." Lydia's fingers toyed with the edge of the music. "Teaching, playing. Are you very happy doing it?" The question rode on teenage curiosity, but it landed like an arrow. Phoebe thought of her mother's hands on the keys in some long-ago parlor, of the way music had been the one thing that had never betrayed them when everything else had. She thought of the birdcage, of the way Greensleeves had sounded in the jeweler's lamplit shop. "Yes," she said, "I am." It was not the whole truth, but it was a part of it. Music was the one thing she had never once resented. Mrs. Vane swept in just then, a rustle of silk and authority. "That will do, Lydia." She bestowed a thin smile on Phoebe. "Thank you, Miss Whitmore. You may send your account after the new year. We are quite overset with Christmas expenses at present." Phoebe's stomach clenched. The Vanes owed her £3, 7 shillings, nearly a third of what she needed. Without it, she might as well not have started. "I am afraid," she said carefully, "that I must ask for payment today, Mrs. Vane." The woman's brows rose. "Today?" "Yes, ma'am." Phoebe kept her tone mild, infusing it with as much humility as she could while still standing upright. "I would not press if it were not important." "A lady does not press," Mrs. Vane said, each word stiff with reprimand. "It is hardly done, Miss Whitmore." "No," Phoebe agreed, "but as you have observed, I am not a lady." Silence fell like a dropped cloak. Lydia's eyes went wide. Mrs. Vane's lips parted, shock and something darker flickering in her expression. Phoebe's cheeks burned, but she did not look away. "I am a teacher," she continued, quieter now. "And if I am to go on teaching, if I am to keep my rooms and my pianoforte and work, then I must sometimes speak of money. I am sorry if that offends, ma'am." Mrs. Vane bristled. "Really, Miss Whitmore?" Phoebe's mind scrambled. The week loomed behind the woman's shoulder like a specter. Another refusal, and the bird was gone, and with it the last tangible thing her grandmother had ever given her. The words came out of her mouth before she consciously chose them. With the recital approaching, she said lightly, "I had hoped to have all my accounts in order." Lydia's head whipped around. "Recital?" Mrs. Vane narrowed her eyes. "What recital?" "The small affair after Christmas," Phoebe improvised, hands very steady on her gloves. "For my pupils. Lord Whitmore has expressed a passing interest in attending." She felt more than saw the change in the room. The name had slipped out almost without thought. Her mother's cousin, the man who had cut off all contact when Cecilia disgraced the family by marrying a music master. Phoebe had never met him, but his shadow had loomed over her childhood in unpaid debts and cold shoulders turned. Lydia gasped. Mrs. Vane's posture snapped straight. "Whitmore?" Mrs. Vane repeated, a little breathless. "Your relation?" "A distant cousin," Phoebe said, the lie burning her throat even as she recognized its power. "On my mother's side." Mrs. Vane's calculations were transparent on her face. A connection to a peer, even through a disgraced relative, might be worth cultivating. "He is fond of greensleeves," Phoebe added, seeing her advantage. "Lydia's improvement has been so marked that I mentioned she might have a piece ready. It seemed only fair to give her the opportunity." Lydia looked as if she might levitate. Mrs. Vane, on the other hand, all but lunged for her writing desk. "My dear Miss Whitmore, you should have said something sooner," she chided, even as she unlocked a little box and fetched out her purse. "I should not like Lydia's prospects to be damaged by mere bookkeeping." "Of course not." Phoebe swallowed a bitter little laugh. Mrs. Vane counted out the arrears with shaking fingers, then added more. "Here, 2 weeks in advance, see that Lydia is seated where she will be noticed." "Of course, ma'am," Phoebe murmured, tucking the money away. She would have to invent a recital now. Some small gathering of parents and tepid punch served over a slightly unsteady pianoforte. If the real Lord Whitmore ever got word of it, he would likely have her thrown in debtor's prison on principle. Lydia caught her hand as she moved to leave. "Miss Whitmore," she whispered, "do you think he will truly come?" Phoebe forced her lips into a smile. "If he does not, my dear, it shall be his loss." It was not an answer, but it seemed to satisfy. Lydia let her go. In the street outside, Phoebe leaned her head briefly against the cool stone of the Vane's front steps and closed her eyes. "You just lied using the name of the very man who abandoned your family," she told herself. Grandmother would die of the scandal, again. But the coins in her purse clinked with every step she took, nearly £5 now, and each sound was another note of greensleeves, another glimmer of gilt wire, another step toward reclaiming what was rightfully hers. If Mrs. Vane's house smelled of lavender and judgment, Mrs. Tupper's smelled of sugar, frying onions, and the indefatigable hope of people who had far less than the Vanes and yet somehow laughed more. Betsy Tupper barreled into Phoebe the moment she stepped through the narrow door, wrapping her in a hug that nearly knocked the breath out of her. "Miss Whitmore, Mama's let me choose the Christmas hymn, and I want the loudest one." Then we shall have to teach your fingers not to trip over themselves, Phoebe said, patting her curls. Come, let us see if you can pound them into submission without alarming the confectioner below. They played duets until both were breathless with giggles, Betsy missing every other chord, and then finally, miraculously, hitting an entire line correctly. You see, Phoebe cried, you are a natural. I am a noise, Betsy said proudly. Mrs. Tupper appeared in the doorway, flour on her apron and a smudge of sugar on her cheek. You are my noise, she said fondly. Miss Whitmore, you'll stay for a bun? I cannot today, Phoebe said with real regret. I have another lesson, but I shall take your kindness as fuel. Mrs. Tupper pressed a warm, wrapped roll into her hand anyway, along with the exact fee for the lessons. No argument, no delay. Don't you ever be shy about asking, the woman said firmly. You work hard enough. Phoebe's throat felt uncomfortably tight. Thank you, she managed. By the time she reached home that evening, counting and recounting on the way, she had more than half of what she needed. £6, 9 shillings. Enough that, if she pushed hard the next day, if no one refused her outright, if the heavens did not fall, she might actually reach it. Each coin brought the gilt bird closer. Each shilling was another note of its song. She slept that night in snatched fragments, waking every hour to touch the little stack of coins in their hiding place and reassure herself they still existed. The final 2 days blurred into a whirl of parlor after parlor, pair of ink-stained fingers after pair, irritation and gratitude and children's sticky hands catching at her skirts. By midday on the 2nd, she stood in her little sitting room with a cracked plate before her and poured the contents of her purse onto it. The coins tumbled out in a muddle of silver and copper, the sum of every encouraging word, every swallowed retort, every lie and every little truth and every tired smile of the last 4 days. She counted and counted again, heart pounding in her ears. It was all there, exactly there, to the last shilling. £10, 4 shillings, and 6 pence. The entire sum needed to redeem her grandmother's gift. A laugh broke from her, half sob, half hysteria. She could see the bird so clearly, the delicate arches of its cage, the opal crest, the topaz eyes, the slight mechanical tilt of its head before Greensleeves emerged. The last tangible connection to a grandmother she'd never met, but whose gift had brought such unexpected joy. We did it, she whispered to the empty room, to the memory of that elegant hand she never held, to the woman in the next room who resented the existence of both. Her mother's voice drifted through the thin wall. What are you crowing about, girl? Nothing, Phoebe called back, hastily gathering the coins and wrapping them in paper. She did not trust herself to explain without breaking. Just music. Music doesn't pay the rent, Cecilia Whitmore muttered. Today, for once, it did. Phoebe tied the little parcel with string, tucked it and the ticket into her reticule, wrapped her shawl tightly around her shoulders, and set out for Bond Street. Every step toward the jeweler's shop rang with a note of Greensleeves in her head. She could almost hear the little bird clicking awake, tilting its head to listen as she came for it. After all her work, all her planning, all her sacrifices, she would finally bring it home where it belonged. The bell over the door chimed as she entered. The proprietor looked up. All the breath left her lungs at the sight of his face. Chapter 3. Miss Whitmore, he said, and his voice was exactly wrong. Too soft, too full of something like dread. She moved forward until her gloved hand rested, steady as she could make it, atop the glass case. I have brought the sum, she said, and the ticket, within the week as agreed. She laid both before him with careful precision. He did not take them. Her heartbeat, which had been leaping with something giddy and wild all morning, stumbled. Is there a problem? Miss Whitmore. The jeweler took off his spectacles and rubbed the bridge of his nose. He looked older than he had the last time she'd seen him. There has been a most unfortunate occurrence. Her fingers curled slowly on the glass. What occurrence? The very afternoon you left, he said. A gentleman came in. Lord St. Ives. He saw the automaton. I did not mean to show it to him, you understand, but he caught sight of it and insisted. He straightened, his tone becoming brisk. Naturally, I sold it to him. But it was pledged, she said, her voice suddenly thin. It was not for sale. Business, my dear. He offered £100. 100. Her lungs seemed to forget their purpose. It would have been foolish to refuse. The jeweler shook his head. A sum like that for such a trinket, one can't be sentimental in this profession. But you promised. We had an agreement. She pulled out the pawn ticket with fingers that had gone numb. I have brought exactly what we agreed upon, every penny. The jeweler's expression shifted slightly, a hint of something like discomfort crossing his face. I did not expect you to return, Miss Whitmore. Most pledges are never redeemed, especially by what? She asked softly. By music teachers? By women without protectors? He had the decency to flush. By anyone. You sold my grandmother's gift. The grief in her voice sounded like anger, even to her own ears. The last thing I had of her. Now his discomfort was unmistakable. Miss Whitmore, I am deeply sorry. I will, of course, return your stake, and if a small consideration would. She looked at the money under the glass. At her reflection, white-faced, eyes hollow, shawl pulled tight like armor. I don't want your consideration, she said. I did not break your promise. Lord St. Ives did not break it. You did. He flushed, color washing up under his collar. She picked up the pawn ticket from the counter, crushed it in her gloved hand, and slid the packet of coins back into her reticule. The money felt suddenly heavy and sour. She had what she had worked for, and nothing she had worked for. Her grandmother's bird, the only proof that the old lady had ever known or cared she existed, was in another person's house now, singing to someone who had never needed it. Give me his direction, she said. The jeweler blinked. Miss Whitmore, surely you cannot mean to. Surely I can, she replied, and I do. Her hand did not tremble. Her insides did. If my grandmother's legacy now sits in Lord St. Ives's possession, then I shall go and fetch it. It is not proper, he tried feebly. For a young lady, too, she laughed, soft and humorless. We have established, I think, that I am not a lady. That luxury was sold along with the bird. His shoulders sagged. He opened a drawer, took out a small leather-bound book, and turned pages with reluctant fingers. He gave her the address in Brook Street. She committed it to memory and nodded once. Thank you, she said, for telling me, not for anything else. Then she left, the bell chiming behind her like a clock striking the hour of some irrevocable change. The air outside was colder than before, the light thinner. The houses of Mayfair rose around her, elegant and indifferent. She tightened her shawl and started to walk. If an earl had taken her grandmother's hope, an earl could damned well look her in the eye while he kept it. Elliot Hawthorne sat at his desk, staring at the latest letter from his estate manager in Yorkshire. A late blight had affected the wheat crop, threatening the winter stores. The tenants were growing anxious. Money would need to be sent. Decisions would need to be made. He should have cared more than he did. The £100 he'd spent on that gilt birdcage for Lady Clarissa yesterday had been extravagant, even for him, not that it mattered. Money was merely a number on a ledger to someone in his position. The trinket had caught his eye, he'd wanted it, he'd bought it. Simple as that. The fact that Lady Clarissa now had an expensive bauble she likely didn't appreciate was of no consequence. One purchased trinkets for women. It was what one did. At 8 o'clock, his butler brought in the day's post on a silver salver. Among the usual stiff rectangles of card and circulars sat a note sealed with a crest he recognized, the Penholms. His stomach did an odd little twist as he broke the seal. Lady Clarissa's hand was neat, controlled, painfully correct. Her words were the same. My lord, I find myself obliged to decline your kind offer of driving in the park this afternoon, as I am, regrettably, indisposed. I trust we may meet at some later date in better health. My mother sends her compliments. Yours, etc., Clarissa Penholm Elliot stared at the page for a long moment, then let out a short, incredulous laugh. Indisposed, he repeated. Of course you are. He crumpled the note and threw it toward the fireplace. It missed and landed on the hearth rug, which struck him as an excellent metaphor for the entire situation. Clarissa Penholm was exactly the sort of woman he ought to marry. Pretty, well-bred, with bloodlines that made dowagers sigh and fortunes that made solicitors purr. For weeks, all of London had watched them dance and converse and sit together at supper, counting the steps to the inevitable proposal like strokes of a clock. She had apparently decided to stop the clock herself. The little gilt birdcage had been intended as a Christmas token, charming but not too significant. Clearly, the message had been understood all too well. She hadn't even mentioned the gift in her note, but her sudden indisposition spoke volumes. "Congratulations, Hawthorne," he muttered. "You have successfully prevented a marriage." The household clock chimed the half-hour. He had an engagement in Bloomsbury that he ought to cancel, now that Clarissa had freed him from the obligation to be entertaining, but the habit of keeping appointments was ingrained enough that he found himself shrugging into his coat and going anyway. An hour later, he was stepping from his carriage onto the discreet side street where Madame Rossetti maintained her elegant apartments. The building's facade was respectable enough, though anyone with a discerning eye would note the lack of family crests or the slightly too bright brass fixtures. It was a place where gentlemen visited, not where they lived. The footman recognized him instantly, of course, and led him upstairs without announcement. He'd been a regular visitor for nearly 6 months now. Madame Rossetti received him in a dressing gown that cost a year's wages for most men, her black hair loose down her back, diamond drops in her ears, the same he had sent only yesterday, still bright with the polish of the jeweler's hand. She flung her arms around his neck and kissed him with the enthusiasm of someone embracing a winning lottery ticket. "Oh, my lord, they are heavenly," she breathed, stepping back to preen in the mirror. "How could you afford them? You must not ruin yourself for my sake." "I am in no danger of ruin," he said, "and I thought you ought to have something to remember me by." Her reflection pouted at him prettily. "You make it sound as if you are saying goodbye." He watched her admire herself, the diamonds winking in the gaslight. Another trinket, another transaction. When had it all become so tedious? He had thought, when he began keeping an opera singer, that the arrangement would make life simpler. It had for a little while. Coins for kisses, gifts for a kind of affection that was part performance, part habit. No illusions, no expectations of vows. Now, watching her clasp gemstone and gold around her throat, he felt only tired. "Yes," he said quietly, "I am." She turned, genuine hurt flickering through the practiced astonishment. "You cannot mean it." "I do." He reached into his coat and drew out an envelope. "This will see you through for some time. You have been generous with your company. I would prefer we part before we grow to resent one another." She snatched the envelope, eyes flicking to the thickness of it. Tears glimmered on her lashes. "Is there someone else?" "There is no one," he said. That, at least, was true, which is rather the point. He stayed long enough to be polite, long enough to let her be angry, and then resigned, to murmur the sort of reassurances men always gave when they left women in the comfortable aftermath of purchased passion. But when he left her rooms, he felt strangely hollowed out, as if someone had scooped the substance out of him and left only form. The drive back to Brook Street through the snow-dusted streets gave him too much time to think. It was not a state he particularly enjoyed. Social obligations, parliamentary duties, the occasional horse race or boxing match, all served their purpose of filling his days with noise and motion that required no deep consideration. Today, however, the world seemed determined to leave him alone with his thoughts. Back in his own house at last, he loosened his cravat, discarded his gloves on the hall table, and went straight to his study. He was pouring himself a drink, far too early in the day for it, but the hour felt strange and unfixed anyway, when there was a discreet tap at the door. His butler appeared, the perfect image of controlled unease. "My lord," he said, "there is a visitor to see you." Elliot lifted one brow. "I told you I wasn't at home to callers this afternoon." "Yes, my lord, I informed her of the same. She declined to accept it." "She?" He set down the decanter. "An actress?" "I do not believe so, my lord." "A tradesman's wife, then, come to complain that her husband has lost his wages at cards," he suggested. The butler's expression did not change, but something in his eyes said even that did not quite touch the situation. "She is alone," he said, "and quite determined. I felt it best to consult you." Most men in his position would have sent her away unheard. Elliot was not, he told himself, most men. In truth, he was merely bored, and raw enough from the morning's encounters that the prospect of a new absurdity held a certain appeal. "Very well," he said, "show her in. If she is selling religious tracts, I reserve the right to flee by the window." "Yes, my lord." The butler withdrew. Elliot took a sip of his drink. set it down, and leaned one hip against the desk, all indolent elegance. The space where the birdcage had briefly sat was empty now, just a polished square of mahogany. The door opened. The young woman who stepped over the threshold was not at all what he had expected. She was not painted or overdressed, not fluttering, not simpering. Her cloak was plain, the hem of her gown clean but worn. Snow still clung in fine crystals to the dark hair escaping her bonnet. Her cheeks were flushed from the cold and from something else, fury perhaps, or fear held very tightly in check. Her eyes, when they met his, were remarkable, a warm, deep gold brown that brought to mind strong tea held up to the light. They did not waver. "I have come for my bird." Chapter 4. I have come for my bird. Lord St. Ives straightened, one eyebrow lifting in an elegant arch that suggested Phoebe had just said something mildly entertaining rather than made a demand. His posture remained relaxed against the desk, but his dark eyes sharpened with interest. "That," he said in a rich, amused drawl, "is a most intriguing beginning to any conversation, Miss Whitmore," she said, fingers clenching around the pawn ticket until it crackled. Phoebe Whitmore. She hadn't expected him to be so tall, nor so immediately commanding of the space around him. His tailored coat emphasized broad shoulders. His auburn hair was brushed back from features that painters would likely describe as aristocratic. But it was his eyes that unsettled her, too perceptive, too aware, studying her with the casual entitlement of a man accustomed to examining whatever caught his interest. "Your bird," he repeated, as if tasting the phrase for novelty. "I don't recall acquiring any living creatures recently, avian or otherwise." "The automaton," Phoebe said, her voice tightening with effort. "A mechanical bird in a gilt cage that plays greensleeves. I pawned it at Hale & Son on Bond Street. You purchased it yesterday." Something flickered in his expression, recognition perhaps. He straightened from the desk. "Ah," he said, "that bird. Yes, that bird. My bird." She took a step forward. "It belonged to my grandmother. It was pledged, not sold. I returned with the money within the agreed time. The jeweler had no right to sell it to you." Lord St. Ives studied her with a new intensity that made her skin prickle, and yet he did. He broke his word. A regrettable business practice. His tone suggested it was anything but regrettable to him. "However, Miss Whitmore, I'm afraid I no longer have the item in question." Her chest constricted. "What do you mean?" "I sent it as a gift, to a lady." The words hit like a physical blow. A gift, to a lady. Of course, someone beautiful and wealthy, someone whose affections were worth £100 of frivolous spending, someone who would display the cage as a pretty curiosity, never knowing what it truly meant. "I see," she managed. "I doubt that you do." He tilted his head slightly. "You appear distressed, Miss Whitmore." The casual observation, as if her feelings were a mildly interesting weather pattern, snapped something inside her. "That bird is the only thing I have from my grandmother," she said, each word precise despite the tremor in her voice. "I pawned it because I had no choice. I spent 4 days collecting every penny I was owed to redeem it in time. And now you tell me you've given it away as a trinket?" He blinked, apparently surprised by her directness. The jeweler should never have sold what was not his to sell. That much is clear. "But you bought it anyway," she pressed, without asking how he came to possess it. "I saw something I wanted. I purchased it," he said with maddening simplicity. "I didn't realize there was a tragic history attached." Phoebe's fingers tightened around the pawn ticket. "Not tragic, my lord. Just ordinary. The kind of ordinary you've never had to consider." His mouth tightened almost imperceptibly. "You presume a great deal about me, Miss Whitmore. And you presumed nothing when you saw my bird and decided it should be yours?" For the first time, he appeared genuinely taken aback. His gaze swept over her again, this time more carefully, noting her plain wool dress, the careful darning at her sleeve, the worn leather of her gloves. "Why was it pawned?" he asked, his tone shifting to something less casual. "If it meant so much to you." Heat flooded her cheeks at the implied accusation. "Not everyone shares your fortune, my lord," she said, unable to keep the bitterness from her voice. "Some of us have obligations. Rent, a brother to bring home from school." She stopped abruptly, realizing she'd said more than intended. "I do not owe you an explanation." "No," he agreed after a moment. You don't. Phoebe took a steadying breath. This was pointless. The bird was gone, given to some lady who probably had dozens of such trinkets. She had been a fool to think she could march into an earl's house and demand justice, as if the rules that governed her world applied equally to his. I apologize for disturbing you, she said stiffly, turning toward the door. I won't take more of your time. Wait. She paused, not quite looking back. Miss Whitmore, his voice had lost some of its drawl. Who was the lady? Your grandmother? The unexpected question made her turn. I never met her, she said quietly. She died before I was born. The bird was left to me in her will. It's the only proof I have that she ever thought of me at all. Something shifted in his expression, a subtle change she couldn't quite read. I see, he said, and for once he seemed to mean it. Phoebe waited, uncertain. Perhaps, he said slowly, as if the words were unfamiliar to him, there is something I can do. What do you mean? The lady to whom I sent your bird, Lady Clarissa Penholm, is an acquaintance, nothing more. His mouth curved in a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Our association has recently cooled, in fact. She must be very special to receive such an expensive gift, Phoebe said, unable to keep the edge from her voice. His laugh surprised her, short and genuinely amused. Special? No. Suitable, perhaps. There is a difference. He waved a dismissive hand. She has dozens of such ornaments. I doubt she'll particularly miss this one. The casual way he discarded both the lady and the gift made Phoebe's indignation flare anew. To treat people and possessions with such disregard, as if neither had true value beyond momentary utility, struck her as profoundly wrong. You are insufferable, she said before she could stop herself. His brows rose. Insufferable, and yet still standing between you and what you want. She flushed. What exactly are you suggesting, my lord? That I might retrieve your bird. He stepped closer, and suddenly the room felt smaller. I could simply explain that it was sent in error. Hope flickered, unexpected and dangerous. And you believe she would return it? Lady Clarissa is many things, but she is not unreasonable, particularly as our understanding has concluded. The way he referred to their relationship as a mere understanding that could be concluded without apparent regret only reinforced Phoebe's impression of him as cold and calculating. And yet he was offering to help her. Why would you do this? She asked, suspicion coloring her tone. He studied her with those unnerving eyes. Perhaps because you've presented me with the most interesting dilemma I've encountered in months. A pause. Or perhaps I have a conscience after all. It would certainly surprise my mother. Phoebe couldn't tell if he was mocking her or himself. Either way, she had little choice but to accept his offer. The bird was beyond her reach otherwise. I would be grateful, she said formally. Then it's settled. I shall retrieve your grandmother's gift. He moved to his desk. Where shall I deliver it when I succeed? She hesitated. The thought of this man appearing at her door, of her neighbor's whispers, of her mother's shock, made her stomach twist. I can return tomorrow, she offered. No. His tone brooked no argument. I shall bring it to you. That is part of the bargain. She couldn't imagine what bargain he was referring to, but his expression made it clear he wouldn't yield on this point. 14 Bramble Street, she said reluctantly. 2nd floor. His eyebrows lifted slightly, the only indication that he recognized the address as being in one of London's less reputable neighborhoods. I shall find it, he said. Phoebe nodded once, suddenly eager to be gone from this room with its leather chairs and gleaming wood, its casual display of wealth, its master who made her feel too many contradictory things at once. Good day, my lord. Until tomorrow, Miss Whitmore. His voice followed her to the door, smooth and assured, as if her bird's return were already accomplished, as if a promise from the Earl of St. Ives carried the weight of certainty. Phoebe didn't look back as she left. She wouldn't let herself hope too strongly. Men like him made promises to women like her all the time, and just as easily forgot them. But a small, treacherous part of her couldn't help but wonder if perhaps, she might see her grandmother's bird again after all. Elliot watched the door close behind Miss Whitmore, tapping his fingers thoughtfully against the desk. Well, that had been unexpected. He hadn't anticipated the fierce dignity in those amber eyes, nor the way she'd spoken to him, as if his title were merely an inconvenient detail rather than an insurmountable barrier. Most surprising of all had been his own reaction to her story. The bird meant something to her, something real. And that, Elliot reflected as he reached for pen and paper to compose a carefully worded note to Lady Clarissa, was a novelty worth pursuing. Chapter 5. Elliot stood before the Penholm residence, an imposing four-story mansion in the most fashionable corner of Mayfair, and questioned his sanity. He was about to request the return of a gift, a breach of etiquette bordering on the unforgivable, from a woman whose family had been carefully positioning her as his future countess for months. And he was doing it for a woman he'd met precisely once, whose fierce amber eyes and stubborn chin had somehow compelled him to promise something ridiculous. Lord St. Ives, the butler intoned as he swept open the door. What an unexpected pleasure. The man's tone suggested it was neither unexpected nor particularly pleasurable. Word of his cooled ardor toward Lady Clarissa had clearly reached the servants already. "I wish to speak with Lady Clarissa," Elliot said smoothly, handing over his hat and gloves. "A brief matter requiring her attention." The butler's face remained impressively neutral. "Of course, my lord. The ladies are receiving in the blue drawing room." Ladies, plural. Excellent. Lady Penholm would be there as well, which would make this all the more awkward. Elliot followed the butler up a sweeping staircase, past gilt-framed portraits of Penholms both recent and ancient, their features growing progressively less attractive and more aristocratic with each generation. The blue drawing room was exactly that, a study in various shades of azure from the palest morning sky to the deepest midnight, with furnishings displaying both wealth and taste in equal measure. Lady Clarissa sat at the pianoforte, positioned to catch the best light from the tall windows. She was pretty in the conventional way of young ladies raised for marriage, golden-haired, blue-eyed, with a complexion carefully maintained through limited exposure to the sun. Her fingers moved listlessly over the keys, producing sounds that suggested music was something to be endured rather than enjoyed. At his announcement, she looked up with a start that seemed rehearsed. "Lord St. Ives!" Her fingers stilled on the keys. What a delightful surprise. Lady Penholm rose from her seat by the fire, her smile as calculated as a banker's ledger. "Lord St. Ives! How unexpected." A delicate pause. "I trust you received Clarissa's note about her indisposition yesterday?" The slight hesitation before indisposition made it clear she knew exactly what her daughter had done, and that she wasn't entirely pleased about it. The bird had been an expensive gift after all. One didn't casually reject a suitor who spent so lavishly. "Come, my lord, even a brief visit is a treasure," Lady Penholm declared, gesturing to a chair positioned at precisely the right distance from her daughter, close enough for conversation, far enough for propriety. "Tea, perhaps? Or something stronger?" "Nothing, thank you." Elliot remained standing, a signal this was indeed to be brief. "I've come on a rather specific matter." Lady Clarissa's smile faltered slightly. "Oh? The gift I sent the other day," he began, watching her face carefully. "The mechanical bird." A shadow crossed her features so quickly he might have imagined it if he hadn't been looking for exactly such a reaction. "Yes," she said, her voice carefully modulated. "A charming piece. I'm afraid there's been a rather awkward mistake." Elliot infused his tone with rueful charm, the sort that had extracted him from social entanglements countless times. "My sister's daughter is visiting for Christmas, and it seems my secretary confused the parcels. The bird was intended for my niece, while her gift was meant for you." Lady Clarissa blinked rapidly. "Your niece?" "Yes." The falsehood rolled from his tongue with practiced ease. "The child has been inconsolable. She's quite taken with mechanical curiosities." "I see." Lady Clarissa's fingers twisted in her lap. "How? Unfortunate." Lady Penholm recovered more quickly. "Of course, we understand completely. Such mistakes are perfectly commonplace with servants. Clarissa would be delighted to exchange the gifts, wouldn't you, dear?" "Naturally," Lady Clarissa agreed, though her expression suggested the opposite. "Though I must confess I've grown rather fond of the little bird." Had she indeed? Elliot studied her face, noting the way her gaze slid away from his. For someone rather fond of the gift, she seemed remarkably reluctant to discuss it. "I'm sure your gift will be equally charming," Lady Penholm interjected. "What was it that the child received instead, my lord?" A jeweled fan, Elliot improvised. Quite unsuitable for a 10-year-old, I'm afraid. My secretary shall face stern words. How dreadful, Lady Clarissa murmured, though a jeweled fan sounds lovely. Her mother shot her a warning glance. And of course we shall rectify the situation immediately. Clarissa, perhaps you could fetch the bird now? A flush rose in Lady Clarissa's cheeks. I'm afraid that's not possible. Elliot raised an eyebrow. Oh, it's not here at present. Her fingers pleated the fabric of her dress. The mechanism made an odd sound yesterday evening. I thought it best to send it to be repaired. Repaired. Elliot kept his tone neutral, though disbelief coursed through him. The bird had been in perfect working order when he purchased it. How conscientious of you. I wanted it to be perfect, she said, a brittle edge to her smile. One takes care of treasured gifts. Lady Penholm cleared her throat. When do you expect it back, dear? Tomorrow, Lady Clarissa said quickly. They promised to have it ready by tomorrow afternoon. Excellent. Elliot smiled with a warmth that didn't reach his eyes. Then I shall call again tomorrow to collect it. Shall we say 3 o'clock? 3 o'clock, Lady Penholm confirmed before her daughter could speak. Perfectly suitable. A maid entered with tea, her eyes widening slightly when she saw him. As she set the tray down, she cast a quick, nervous glance toward Lady Clarissa, then lowered her gaze to the floor. Interesting. I won't keep you from your tea, Elliot said, stepping back. Until tomorrow, then. You won't stay? Lady Clarissa asked, a note of panic in her voice. I'm sure my mother would appreciate hearing more about your Christmas plans. Another time, perhaps. And the fan? Lady Penholm asked. Should we expect to receive it when you collect the bird? Of course, Elliot said smoothly. I shall bring it with me. He bowed again, noting the way Lady Clarissa's hands trembled slightly as she reached for the teapot. Whatever was happening here, the bird was almost certainly not being repaired. He'd wager his best hunter that Lady Clarissa Penholm had no idea where the mechanical bird was at this very moment. As he descended the stairs, he caught a fragment of urgent whispers from a small antechamber. Told her ladyship it would fetch £5 at most. The voices cut off abruptly as the butler appeared to escort him to the door. £5. For something that had cost him 100 and meant the world to Miss Whitmore. Outside, Elliot stood on the steps for a moment, considering. He could, of course, confront Lady Clarissa directly, demand the truth, but that would almost certainly lead to tears, denials, and the permanent closing of doors throughout the ton. Not that he particularly cared about the latter, but it would complicate matters unnecessarily. No, better to wait until tomorrow. Lady Clarissa would produce the bird, whether it had truly been sent for repair or whether she needed time to retrieve it from wherever she'd actually sent it. He suspected the latter, but either way, the result would be the same. She was too well-bred to deny him outright, too conscious of her family's position to risk offense over a trinket. In the meantime, there was the question of what to tell Miss Whitmore. The sensible course would be to wait until he had the bird in hand, to appear triumphant at her door in Bramble Street tomorrow evening, the lost treasure recovered. But something about those amber eyes, that stubborn chin, made him reluctant to leave her in suspense. She'd waited long enough for her grandmother's gift. She deserved to know it would soon be returned, even if he wasn't entirely certain that was true. He would call on her this evening, explain that the bird would be retrieved tomorrow. Perhaps bring something practical, a goose for Christmas, or a hamper with tea and oranges, the sort of gift that acknowledged the season without overstepping propriety. Brook Street, my lord? His coachman asked as Elliot approached his waiting carriage. No, Elliot said, decision made. Take me to Bramble Street, number 14, but first stop at Fortnum's. The coachman's eyebrows rose a fraction, but he nodded. Yes, my lord. As the carriage pulled away from the curb, Elliot wondered what Miss Whitmore would be doing at this hour. He tried to picture her in her own home, a small flat, simply furnished but neat. Books, likely, a writing desk, perhaps sheet music stacked in careful piles. He wondered if she would be pleased to see him, or merely surprised, if those remarkable eyes would light with hope or narrow with suspicion. Either way, he found himself looking forward to finding out. It was a novel sensation, anticipation, almost uncomfortable in its unfamiliarity. The carriage turned north, leaving the broad, well-paved streets of Mayfair behind. As the buildings grew shabbier and the roads narrower, Elliot settled back against the leather seat and contemplated what he would say to Miss Whitmore when they met again. The truth, but perhaps not all of it. Not yet. Chapter 6. The commotion outside Phoebe's window began as a murmur and built to something closer to a small riot. She looked up from the letter she'd been writing to Henry's school, a note of thanks for their patience, informing them that all fees had been paid and arrangements made for his Christmas transport home, and frowned at the sudden swell of voices. Bramble Street was never quiet, but this was different. Excited, speculative, the particular pitch of neighbors who'd spotted something worth talking about. Phoebe rose and moved to the window, pulling back the threadbare curtain just enough to peer out. Her heart stopped. A carriage stood at the curb below. Not just any carriage, a gleaming black equipage with brass fittings that caught the winter light like struck gold, pulled by a matched pair of chestnuts that likely cost more than her annual income. The crest on the door was too small to read from her second-floor window, but she didn't need to see it clearly to know whose carriage it was. Lord St. Ives had come to call on Bramble Street, at her building, where at least a dozen neighbors were already gathering to gawk at the spectacle, and Mrs. Henshaw from the ground floor was actually leaning out her window to get a better look, her mob cap askew and her mouth hanging open in a way that would have been comical if Phoebe weren't currently dying of mortification. "No," Phoebe whispered. "No, no, no." She watched in horror as a liveried footman descended from the back of the carriage and moved to open the door. A tall figure emerged, auburn hair bare to the winter air, coat cut with the kind of precision that announced wealth before he'd taken 2 steps. He glanced up at the building with an expression of mild interest, as if calling on music teachers in shabby neighborhoods was something he did every Tuesday. The crowd parted for him like the Red Sea for Moses. Phoebe didn't wait to see more. She spun from the window, her mind racing. He was coming here, to her home, where everyone could see him, where they would talk, where they would assume. Dear God, what would they assume? And Henry arriving tomorrow, what would her brother think when he heard the gossip? She'd worked so hard to give them all a peaceful Christmas, and now this. "Phoebe?" Her mother's voice drifted through the adjoining door. "What is all that noise outside?" "Nothing," Phoebe called, already grabbing her shawl and wrapping it around her shoulders with shaking fingers. "I'll handle it." She needed to intercept him before he knocked, before he drew any more attention, before the entire street gathered to witness an earl calling on the Whitmore women and speculated themselves into a frenzy about what it could possibly mean. Too late. The knock came just as Phoebe reached the sitting room door, firm, confident, the sort of knock that expected to be answered promptly. Mrs. Henshaw's voice carried up the stairwell, shrill with barely suppressed excitement. "I'll get it. Don't you worry, Miss Whitmore. I'll get the door for you." Of course she would. The woman had probably been waiting her entire life for something this interesting to happen in their building. Phoebe flew down the narrow stairs, skirts gathered in one hand, attempting to look dignified while also moving at a speed that suggested the building might be on fire. She reached the small entrance hall just as Mrs. Henshaw pulled open the door with theatrical flourish. "Good afternoon, sir," the woman practically sang. "And what a fine afternoon it is, isn't it? Though cold, very cold, but you look quite warm in that lovely coat, don't you? So well made, so very." "Thank you," Lord St. Ives said smoothly, his voice carrying the kind of polite finality that could end conversations without giving offense. His gaze moved past Mrs. Henshaw and found Phoebe on the stairs. Something shifted in his expression, amusement perhaps at her obvious panic. "Miss Whitmore, good afternoon." "My lord," Phoebe descending the last few steps with as much dignity as she could muster while her heart attempted to beat its way out of her chest. "This is unexpected. I hope not too unwelcome." He held a large wrapped parcel in his arms. "I have news about your grandmother's bird. I also took the liberty of bringing something for the season." Mrs. Henshaw's eyes went wide as saucers. "News? A gift?" Miss Whitmore, you didn't mention you were expecting a gentleman caller. And such a fine gentleman, too. Is he one of your students' fathers? Though I've never seen you teach anyone old enough to have a— Mrs. Henshaw, Phoebe interrupted, her cheeks burning. Thank you for answering the door. I'll see to Lord St. Ives now. The use of his title landed like a stone in still water. Mrs. Henshaw's mouth worked soundlessly for a moment before she managed a slightly strangled, "A lord? Here." "Indeed," St. Ives said pleasantly. "Here." He stepped past Mrs. Henshaw with the ease of someone accustomed to people moving aside for him, and suddenly the small entrance hall felt impossibly crowded. He seemed to take up all the available space, not just physically, though he was certainly tall enough to make the low ceiling feel lower, but in some indefinable way that made Phoebe acutely aware of the cracked plaster on the walls, the worn runner on the stairs, the general shabbiness of everything he was currently surveying with those too perceptive dark eyes. "Perhaps we might speak upstairs?" Phoebe suggested, trying to inject some authority into her voice despite feeling like a rabbit cornered by a very well-dressed fox. "Mrs. Henshaw, I'm sure you have." "Oh, I'll just wait right here," Mrs. Henshaw said, settling herself against the wall as if preparing for a lengthy show. "In case you need anything, propriety and all." Phoebe resisted the urge to scream. How thoughtful. She turned and led the way up the narrow staircase, hearing St. Ives's measured footsteps behind her and Mrs. Henshaw's wheezing breath as the woman craned her neck to watch them ascend. The door to their rooms stood slightly ajar. Through it, Phoebe could see her mother standing in the center of the sitting room, hands clasped at her waist, spine straight, chin lifted, every inch the Baron's daughter she'd been born, despite the faded day dress and the fact that she was currently standing in two rooms that could have fit comfortably inside most aristocratic closets. Cecilia Whitmore's gaze moved from Phoebe to the tall gentleman following her, and something flickered in her expression. Recognition, perhaps, or simply the bone-deep knowledge of what a man of quality looked like, even after 25 years of reduced circumstances. "Mama," Phoebe said, her voice only slightly strained. "Lord St. Ives has called. My lord, may I present my mother, Mrs. Whitmore?" St. Ives set the hamper carefully on the small table by the door and bowed, a proper bow, the sort reserved for ladies of quality. "Mrs. Whitmore, I'm delighted to make your acquaintance." Her mother's eyebrows rose fractionally, but her curtsy was perfect. "Lord St. Ives, this is an unexpected honor." "The honor is mine," he said smoothly. "I hope I'm not calling at an inconvenient time." "Not at all." Her mother's tone was gracious, though her eyes remained sharp as she gestured to their modest sitting area. "Please, do sit. Phoebe, perhaps some tea?" Phoebe moved toward their tiny kitchen alcove, grateful for something to do with her hands. The kettle was already warm on the hob. They kept it ready throughout the day to save on coal, and she busied herself preparing the tea service. Their best cups, cracked though one was, the last of their sugar. A small plate with 3 biscuits she'd been saving. Behind her, she heard her mother making polite conversation. "You've come from Mayfair, I presume?" Cecilia asked. "Brook Street, yes." A pause. "I confess, I'm not familiar with this part of London." "Few of your station are, my lord." Her mother's tone held no bitterness, merely statement of fact. "It's a respectable enough neighborhood, though not fashionable." "Respectability is more important than fashion, I've always thought." Phoebe nearly dropped the teapot. She doubted Lord St. Ives had ever prioritized respectability over fashion in his entire privileged life. She carried the tea tray into the sitting room to find St. Ives seated in their best chair, which was still threadbare and listing slightly to the left, while her mother occupied the settee with the bearing of a duchess on a throne. The contrast between his evident quality and their shabby surroundings made Phoebe's chest tight. "Thank you, dear," her mother said as Phoebe set the tray on the low table. "Lord St. Ives was just telling me about the remarkable snowfall last week. Apparently it caused quite the disruption to traffic." "How interesting," Phoebe said faintly, taking her seat beside her mother and beginning to pour. The ritual of tea, measuring, pouring, the tiny spoon clinking against china, gave her something to focus on besides the surreal image of an earl sitting in their shabby rooms. "I've brought a small token for the season," St. Ives said, gesturing to the hamper by the door. Nothing elaborate. I happened to pass Fortnum's on my way and thought it appropriate for Christmas. Phoebe's hand trembled slightly as she passed him his cup. That's very generous, my lord, but truly not necessary. I disagree. He accepted the tea with a nod of thanks. You showed me considerable patience yesterday despite my intrusion into your business. The least I can do is acknowledge the season properly. Cecilia's gaze cut to Phoebe with obvious curiosity, but she said nothing. A knock at the door made all three of them turn. Before Phoebe could rise, the door pushed open, and Mrs. Henshaw bustled in, carrying a small plate. I thought you might like some of my ginger biscuits, she announced, her eyes darting between St. Ives and Phoebe with unconcealed glee. Fresh baked this morning. I know how you enjoy them, Miss Whitmore, and I thought, well, with such distinguished company. How thoughtful, Mrs. Henshaw, Cecilia said with remarkable patience. You may leave them on the table. Oh, I don't mind staying a moment. Mrs. Henshaw set down the plate and showed no signs of leaving, just to make sure you have everything you need, propriety and all, with a gentleman caller. My mother is an excellent chaperone, I assure you, Phoebe said through gritted teeth. Of course. I only meant. Mrs. Henshaw's gaze fixed on the hamper. My, what a lovely basket, so large. And from Fortnum's, did you say? Such an establishment. I've heard their goods are simply. Mrs. Henshaw, Cecilia said, her voice taking on the unmistakable tone of command that came from decades of good breeding. Thank you for your kindness. We'll call if we require anything further. It was a dismissal, clear and final. Mrs. Henshaw's mouth worked for a moment, then she bobbed an awkward curtsy, more to St. Ives than to them, and back toward the door. Of course, Mrs. Whitmore. Miss Whitmore, my lord. Such an honor, such a very great honor. I'll just be downstairs if you need anything. Anything at all. The door closed behind her, but Phoebe could hear her hovering just outside, no doubt with her ear pressed to the wood. Your neighbors seem attentive, St. Ives observed mildly. They're bored, Phoebe said, and you're the most interesting thing to happen on Bramble Street since the butcher's boy ran off with the greengrocer's daughter last spring. Phoebe, her mother murmured. It's true, Mama. By sunset, everyone within 3 streets will know an earl called on us. By tomorrow, they'll have us engaged or ruined or both. St. Ives set down his teacup. I apologize. I didn't consider the implications of calling personally. No, Phoebe said, suddenly tired, you wouldn't have. Silence fell, awkward and thick. Her mother shot Phoebe a reproving look, but St. Ives appeared more thoughtful than offended. You're right, he said finally. I didn't think about how my presence here might affect your reputation. I should have sent a note. The admission surprised Phoebe enough that her irritation faltered. It's done now. Yes, he straightened in the listing chair. Which brings me to why I came. I have good news, Miss Whitmore. I've spoken with Lady Clarissa Penholme, and she's agreed to return your grandmother's automaton. The relief that flooded through Phoebe was so intense it made her light-headed. Everything, all the work, all the worry, the 4 days of exhausting lessons and careful budgeting, it had all been worth it. She'd paid the rent. She'd settled Henry's school fees and arranged his transport home. And now, impossibly, she would have her grandmother's bird back as well. She has? Her voice came out barely above a whisper. She has. The bird is currently being repaired, some small mechanical issue, but I'll collect it tomorrow afternoon and deliver it to you directly. Tomorrow. Phoebe pressed her hands together in her lap to keep them from shaking. You're certain? Quite certain. His expression softened slightly. I gave you my word I would retrieve it. I intend to keep that promise. Phoebe looked down at her hands, suddenly afraid she might embarrass herself by crying. Tomorrow. Henry would arrive tomorrow evening, and she would have the bird to show him. After months of separation, after all her worry about disappointing him, she'd give him the Christmas they deserved. The bird would be there, whole and safe, singing Greensleeves just as it always had, their grandmother's gift restored to them. Thank you. Her throat felt tight. Truly, I cannot express what this means. Henry, my brother, he arrives home from school tomorrow evening. Having the bird back will make our Christmas complete. Your brother is at school? St. Ives asked with genuine interest. Yes, he's 13. It's been several months since we've seen him. Cecilia's voice held warmth despite her wariness. We're very much looking forward to having him home for the holiday. I'm sure he'll be delighted to see you as well, St. Ives said. And to have the bird returned in time for Christmas, that does seem fortuitous. It clearly meant a great deal to your grandmother as well, he continued. To leave such a treasure to a grandchild she never met, she must have been a woman of considerable sentiment. She was devoted to music, Cecilia said carefully, warmth creeping into her voice despite her obvious wariness. She believed it was one of the few pure expressions of human feeling. A woman of refined sensibilities, then. St. Ives looked at Phoebe with genuine interest. Do you share her passion for music, Miss Whitmore? Phoebe felt heat rise in her cheeks. I appreciate music, my lord, as most people do. My daughter is too modest, Cecilia said. She has considerable skill at the pianoforte. Mama, Phoebe warned, shooting her mother a look that promised later discussion. St. Ives was watching this exchange with undisguised interest, but he didn't press further. I'm glad the bird will be restored to someone who understands its significance. Phoebe stood, setting down her teacup with deliberate finality. Thank you for coming all this way to tell me, my lord. I know you must be very busy, and I wouldn't want to keep you from your obligations. You've done me an enormous service, and I'm more grateful than I can say. And thank you for the hamper. It's very generous. It was a dismissal, politely phrased but unmistakable. St. Ives, however, didn't move. Instead, he glanced toward the small pile of items by the door. Phoebe's music portfolio, her worn cloak, the shopping basket she'd been planning to take with her. Were you going out? He asked. I have a few appointments this afternoon, Phoebe said carefully. Nothing that cannot wait. Nonsense, her mother said, and Phoebe turned to stare at her in betrayal. You have lessons to give, dear, and errands to complete before Henry arrives tomorrow. You mustn't let Lord St. Ives's visit disrupt your schedule. You've always been so conscientious about your commitments. Mama, you mustn't let my visit disrupt your day, St. Ives said, though something in his expression suggested he was genuinely curious. What sort of appointments? Just errands, Phoebe said vaguely. Lessons, various stops around the neighborhood, things that must be done before my brother comes home. St. Ives stood. Then I insist on accompanying you. That's not necessary, Phoebe said quickly. Too quickly. Perhaps not necessary, but after going to the trouble of retrieving your grandmother's bird, I'd hoped you might indulge my curiosity about this part of London. He moved toward the door, collecting his hat and gloves from where he'd set them. Surely that's not too much to ask? A walk through your neighborhood in exchange for the bird? The words were pleasant enough, but Phoebe felt the trap close around her. He was calling in the debt. Not explicitly, not rudely, but unmistakably. How could she refuse the man who was returning her most precious possession? How could she seem ungrateful when he'd done her such an enormous favor? She couldn't, and he knew it. It wasn't a request, not really. And the problem was, Phoebe could see no polite way to refuse without seeming ungracious after he'd just promised to return her grandmother's bird. My lord, she tried, I appreciate the offer, but my appointments are quite ordinary and wouldn't interest. On the contrary, I find myself interested in a great many ordinary things lately. He smiled. Surely you won't deny me a walk on such a pleasant afternoon? It's freezing outside. Then the exercise will do me good. Besides, you shouldn't be carrying all of that through these streets alone. He gestured to her portfolio and basket. Phoebe looked at her mother, silently begging for support. Cecilia merely raised her eyebrows and took a sip of her tea, the picture of unhelpful serenity. Fine, Phoebe said, admitting defeat. She owed him too much to refuse such a small request. But when your feet freeze and you regret this impulse, remember that I tried to dissuade you. Duly noted. He opened the door and gestured for her to precede him. After you, Miss Whitmore. Phoebe gathered her music portfolio and her worn cloak, acutely aware of how shabby both looked compared to his immaculate greatcoat. She caught her mother's eye one last time. Cecilia mouthed something that looked suspiciously like, "Be careful," though whether she meant of his intentions or her own reaction to them, Phoebe couldn't tell. They descended the stairs to find Mrs. Henshaw lurking in the hallway, pretending to dust a table that hadn't been dusty to begin with. Going out, Miss Whitmore? She asked brightly. With his lordship? I have appointments, Phoebe said shortly. "How lovely, such dedication, and such a kind gentleman to escort you." Phoebe didn't trust herself to respond. She pushed through the front door and out onto the street, where the crowd of neighbors had, if anything, grown larger. St. Blas. Ives's carriage still waited at the curb, the horses stamping and snorting in the cold. The coachman straightened as they emerged, clearly expecting his master. "Bennett," St. Ives called. "Return to Brook Street. I'll walk back when I'm finished here." The coachman's eyebrows rose. "My lord, are you certain?" "Quite certain. I'll send word if I need the carriage later. But my lord, it's near 2 miles at least, and the weather will provide excellent exercise." "St. Ma'am." Ives's tone made it clear the discussion was over. "That will be all." Phoebe watched in horror as the coachman climbed back onto the box and gathered the reins. The magnificent carriage pulled away, leaving St. Ives standing on Bramble Street in his expensive coat, looking for all the world like he'd just made a perfectly reasonable decision. The neighbors stared. Mrs. Henshaw gasped from her position in the doorway. Phoebe's last hope of limiting the damage to her reputation evaporated like morning frost. "Shall we?" St. Ives offered his arm, apparently oblivious to the sensation he'd just created. Phoebe stared at him, at his outstretched arm, at the expectant expression on his face that suggested he thought he was being helpful rather than catastrophically presumptuous. All she'd wanted was her grandmother's bird. She'd worked herself to exhaustion, scraped together every penny, paid every obligation, and finally, she'd been about to succeed. Henry would come home to a peaceful Christmas. The bird would sing Greensleeves on Christmas morning. Everything would be perfect. Instead, she now had an earl who just dismissed his carriage to walk through her neighborhood, which meant every gossip within 3 streets would be speculating about their relationship by nightfall. And she couldn't refuse him, not when he was retrieving her grandmother's bird, not when she owed him everything. She took his arm because refusing would only make the situation worse, and because she had no choice. The debt was already too great. "This is a terrible idea," she muttered as they began walking. "Probably," he agreed cheerfully, "but I find myself enjoying terrible ideas lately. They're far more interesting than good ones." Behind them, Phoebe could hear the excited murmur of voices already spreading the news. Tomorrow, she would have her grandmother's bird back. Henry would come home. They would have Christmas together. Today, she was going to be ruined by an earl who thought he was being kind, and the worst part was knowing she'd brought this on herself by asking for his help in the first place. She couldn't decide which prospect terrified her more. Chapter 7. Elliot had walked through many streets in his life, from the fashionable promenades of Mayfair to the gaming hells of St. James's, but he'd never quite walked through anything like Bramble Street with a woman on his arm whose mortification was palpable enough to taste. Miss Whitmore moved with the determined stride of someone fleeing a burning building, though she maintained enough composure to acknowledge the stares and whispers with a nod here, a tight smile there. Her neighbors were making no attempt at discretion. Windows filled with curious faces. Women clutched their marketing baskets and leaned together, whispering. A group of men outside what appeared to be a coaching inn fell silent as they passed, then erupted into speculation the moment they were out of earshot. "You've created quite a sensation," Elliot observed. "You've created quite a sensation," she corrected, her voice low and tense. "I'm merely the unfortunate recipient of your attention." He supposed that was fair. He hadn't considered, truly hadn't thought about, what his carriage appearing on this street would mean for her. In his world, gentlemen called on ladies all the time. It was what one did. The elaborate dance of courtship and connection that required visibility, propriety, witnesses. But looking at the frank speculation on the faces around them, he was beginning to understand that in her world, a gentleman's attention meant something altogether different. Something dangerous. "I apologize," he said quietly. "I didn't think." "No," she agreed. "You didn't." They turned onto a wider street where the buildings looked marginally less shabby. The cold bit at his face, and he pulled his coat closer, wondering if Miss Whitmore was warm enough in her threadbare cloak. He dismissed his carriage without considering that she might need its shelter. Another thoughtless act to add to the growing tally. "My brother comes home tomorrow evening," Phoebe said abruptly, as if the silence had become too heavy. "Henry is 13. He's been at school for months. You must be looking forward to seeing him." "Very much." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "I wanted this to be a peaceful Christmas for my family. The bird restored, Henry home from school, everything as it should be. Instead, by the time he arrives, half of London will be gossiping about his sister and the Earl who dismissed his carriage to walk through Bramble Street with her." The accusation in her words stung. "Miss Whitmore, it's fine." But her tone suggested it was anything but. "You're retrieving my grandmother's bird. I can hardly complain about a walk in exchange for such a favor, can I?" The words were polite, but he heard the resentment beneath them, the awareness that she was trapped by obligation, that she owed him too much to refuse his requests. He'd never thought of it that way, had never considered that his help might feel like a debt rather than kindness. In his world, favors were exchanged freely, without weight or calculation. But clearly, in hers, everything had a cost. They'd gone perhaps 4 streets when a shriek of delight made them both turn. "Miss Phoebe! Miss Phoebe!" A small girl, no more than 7 or 8, came flying down the street, her bonnet ribbons streaming behind her, nearly colliding with Phoebe in her enthusiasm. 2 other children followed at a more sedate pace, though their faces lit up when they saw her. "Betsy!" Phoebe's entire demeanor transformed. The tension in her shoulders eased, her expression softened, and she smiled with genuine warmth. "Goodness, what energy! Have you been practicing your scales?" "Every day," the girl proclaimed proudly. "Mama says I'm driving her to distraction, but I want to play perfectly for the Christmas hymns." "That's wonderful, dear." Phoebe squeezed the girl's hand. "I'm so proud of you." "And I've been practicing too," one of the other children piped up, a boy of perhaps 10. "Mr. Thompson says my fingering has improved remarkably." "I'm delighted to hear it, James." Phoebe's eyes sparkled. "You've been working so hard." The third child, a girl slightly older than Betsy, hung back shyly. Phoebe noticed and gestured her forward. "And Mary? How are your etudes progressing?" "Well, I think, Miss Whitmore." The girl's voice was barely above a whisper. "Though the left hand still gives me trouble." "Left hands are stubborn creatures," Phoebe said seriously. "But you're more stubborn, I think. You'll master it." The girl's face lit up with pleasure. It was only when Betsy tugged on Phoebe's cloak that the children seemed to notice Elliot's presence. 3 pairs of eyes widened in unison as they took in his expensive coat, his polished boots, the unmistakable aura of quality that marked him as someone from another world entirely. "Miss Phoebe," Betsy whispered loudly. "Who's the fancy gentleman?" Elliot bit back a smile at the description. "This is Lord St. Ives," Phoebe said, her tone carefully neutral. "He's a friend." "A lord." James's eyes went round. "A real lord?" "Quite real, I assure you," Elliot said, finding himself oddly charmed by their frank curiosity. "We should let Miss Whitmore continue on her way," a woman's voice called. A motherly figure appeared in the doorway of a nearby shop, beckoning the children. "She has things to do, and you're keeping her with your chatter." "Sorry, Miss Phoebe," Betsy called as they scattered back to their mother. "Not at all, dear. Keep practicing." Phoebe waved, then resumed walking, her pace perhaps slightly faster than before. "You teach music," Elliot said after they'd walked another block in silence. "Yes?" Her voice was careful. "To families in the neighborhood. Those children clearly adore you." A small, genuine smile. "They're good students, most of them. You're very patient with them. Teaching requires patience." She glanced at him. "Surely you had tutors who demonstrated that virtue." "Some more successfully than others," he admitted, "though I suspect I was not the easiest pupil." "No," there was amusement in her voice now. "I cannot imagine that at all, my lord." The teasing note caught him off guard, pleased him more than it should. "I had a regrettable tendency to argue with my Latin tutor about verb conjugations." "Were you correct in your arguments?" "Almost never. But that didn't stop me." She laughed, a real laugh, unguarded and warm. The sound did something peculiar to his chest. They turned down a narrower street where the buildings leaned toward each other like gossiping neighbors. The cobblestones were uneven here, slick with ice where the sun hadn't reached. "Where did you grow up?" Elliot asked, genuinely curious. Here in London, Bloomsbury originally, near the British Museum. Phoebe navigated the treacherous cobblestones with practiced ease. Before my father died, and we had to. Her boot caught on a raised stone mid-sentence. She pitched forward with a startled gasp. Elliot's hands shot out instinctively, catching her around the waist before she could fall. For a heartbeat, they stood frozen, her hands clutching his forearms for balance, his hands spanning her waist, their faces suddenly mere inches apart. He could feel her warmth through the layers of wool and linen, could see the flecks of gold in her brown eyes, wide with surprise, could see the slight parting of her lips as she drew a sharp breath. She started. Are you hurt? His voice came out rougher than intended. No, She seemed to realize how close they were standing. Color flooded her cheeks. Thank you. She stepped back. He let his hands fall away, though some irrational part of him wanted to keep holding on. These cobblestones are treacherous, she said, not quite meeting his eyes. I should have been watching. May I? He offered his arm properly this time, more request than formality. She hesitated, then slipped her hand into the crook of his elbow. Even through their gloves and coats, he was acutely aware of her touch, of the way her fingers rested lightly against his sleeve, of how perfectly her hand fit there. They walked in silence for several minutes, the earlier ease between them replaced by a charged awareness that made the December air feel less cold. You were saying, Elliot prompted gently, about Bloomsbury. It was a long time ago. Her voice had gone quiet. Before my father died, we lived more comfortably then. How old were you? 14. Henry was still in leading strings, barely 3. A sad smile. Old enough for me to remember what it was like. Not old enough to understand why everything had to change afterward. Henry doesn't remember any of it. Not our father, not Bloomsbury, not what we had before. Sometimes I think that's a mercy. The simple words carried layers of loss. A 14-year-old girl watching her world collapse around her, trying to make sense of why their comfortable life had suddenly disappeared. And her baby brother, spared those memories but also robbed of ever knowing their father. He thought of himself at 14, still at school, worrying about exams and cricket matches and whether the cook would make his favorite pudding, secure in the knowledge that nothing would ever really change. I'm sorry, he said, inadequate but sincere. It was a long time ago, she repeated, but her fingers tightened slightly on his arm. They'd reached a small square where a church stood, its steps swept clean of snow. Without discussing it, they both slowed, then stopped. The square was quiet, protected from the wind, almost peaceful. Organ music drifted from inside the church, someone practicing for Christmas services. Phoebe's head tilted slightly, listening with that same absorbed expression he'd noticed before when music was near. You love it, he observed. Music, yes, simple, unguarded. Why? She seemed surprised by the question. Why does anyone love anything? It simply is. That's not an answer. No, I suppose it isn't. She was quiet for a moment, still listening to the organ. My father used to say that music was the only honest language, that people could lie with words, but music always told the truth. Your father was a musician? A music master. He taught the pianoforte. Her voice softened. He died when I was 14. Henry was only 3. He doesn't remember him at all. I'm sorry. It was a long time ago, but her hand tightened on his arm. Everything changed after that. We moved from Bloomsbury to, well, here. My mother did what she could, but it fell to me to... She stopped herself, color rising in her cheeks. Forgive me. You don't need to hear about... I want to hear. And he did, surprisingly. Wanted to know everything about her. You were 14 when you became responsible for your family. Someone had to be. The matter-of-fact way she said it struck him. 14. Still a child herself, suddenly thrust into supporting a grieving mother and a small brother. No wonder she'd grown into this fierce, capable woman who counted every cost and took nothing for granted. You should have had more time to be young, he said quietly. Perhaps, but we rarely get what we should have, do we? She looked up at him then, and something in her expression made his breath catch. We get what we're given, and we make the best of it. Joy must be made, not inherited. He turned the words over in his mind. That's a philosophy worth living by. My grandmother thought so. She wrote it in a letter that came with the bird. It's all I have of her. That letter and the bird itself. And have you? The question slipped out before he could stop it. Made joy? She was quiet for a long moment. The organ music swelled inside the church, then faded. Sometimes, she said finally, in small ways, when a student masters something they thought impossible taught, when Henry comes home and fills our rooms with noise and laughter, when my mother smiles over tea. She met his eyes, small joys, but real ones. He found himself captivated by the way she spoke. No self-pity, no resentment, just quiet acceptance of her life and determination to find light in it. And you, she asked, surprising him, have you made joy, Lord St. Ives? The question struck deeper than she could know. Had he? Or had he simply existed, moving through his days in a comfortable fog of obligations and entertainments that meant nothing, spending money on trinkets he didn't need, attending events he didn't enjoy, maintaining friendships that had no real depth? No, he admitted. I don't think I have. Then perhaps, she paused, and something shifted in her expression, something almost mischievous. Perhaps you can learn, my lord. Before he could respond, she pulled her hand from his arm and bent down. Her gloved fingers scooped up a handful of fresh snow from the church steps, packing it quickly into a small, round ball. Elliot watched, bemused. Miss Whitmore, what are you? She threw it. The snowball hit him square in the chest with a soft thump. For a heartbeat, they both froze, her eyes wide with shock at her own audacity, his expression one of complete astonishment. Then she laughed, a real laugh, bright and unguarded, and ran. Miss Whitmore, he called after her, but she was already halfway across the square, her cloak flying behind her, still laughing. He stood there for a moment, snow dusting his expensive coat, utterly dumbfounded. Then something in him, something that had been dormant for longer than he could remember, sparked to life. He grinned and gave chase. She shrieked when she heard his footsteps, glancing back over her shoulder. Don't you dare! But he was faster, his longer stride eating up the distance between them. He caught her at the far edge of the square, his hands closing gently around her arms as she spun to face him, breathless and laughing. That, he said, his own breath coming faster, was extraordinarily improper. I know. Her eyes sparkled with mirth and something else, something that made his pulse quicken. I don't know what came over me. I shouldn't have. Don't apologize. He was acutely aware of how close they were standing, of her flushed cheeks and bright eyes, of the way her breath made little clouds in the cold air between them, of his hands still resting on her arms. That was the most honest thing anyone has done in my presence in years. Her smile softened. It was silly. It was perfect. His voice came out lower, more intense than intended. You were making joy. Understanding flickered in her eyes. Her lips parted slightly, and for a moment neither of them moved. Snow began to fall more heavily now, soft and silent. The world narrowed to just the two of them standing there, the city fading to nothing. Elliot became aware that he was still holding her, that he should let go, that he should step back and remember who he was, who she was, and all the vast distance between them. He didn't let go. Instead, he reached up slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished. His fingers brushed her cheek, ostensibly to wipe away a smudge of snow, but lingering far longer than necessary. She drew a sharp breath but didn't pull back. Phoebe, he said quietly. Her eyes widened at his use of her Christian name. My lord, Elliot. The correction came out almost as a plea. When we're alone like this, could I be just Elliot? That wouldn't be proper. But her voice was barely a whisper. No, he agreed, it wouldn't be. For a long moment they stood there, caught between propriety and something far more dangerous. His thumb traced along her cheekbone. Her hand came up to rest against his chest. Whether to push him away or hold him there, he couldn't tell. I should get home, she finally said, though she made no move to leave. My mother will worry. Of course. He let his hand fall away, though it cost him something to do it. Stepped back, giving her space. Forgive me. There's nothing to forgive. Her cheeks were flushed, though whether from cold or the run or something else entirely, he couldn't be certain. But I really should. Allow me to see you home. They walked the remaining blocks to Bramble Street in near silence, though the quality of it had changed. Not uncomfortable, precisely. Charged with things unsaid, with the ghost of that touch hanging between them. with the sound of his name on her lips, even unspoken, with the memory of her laughter and the feel of snowflakes melting on warm skin. At the door to number 14, she turned to face him. The afternoon light was fading, casting long shadows across the street. "Thank you," she said, "for walking with me, for listening, for everything." "I'll come tomorrow," he said. The words came out more like a vow than a casual promise. "With news of the bird." "You don't have to. I want to." The intensity in his voice surprised them both. "I want to meet Henry, and I promised you'd have the bird before Christmas. I intend to keep that promise." She studied his face, searching for something. Whatever she found seemed to satisfy her because she gave a small nod. "I believe you." The simple statement carried more weight than she perhaps realized. Trust, freely given despite how recently they'd met, despite the vast gulf between their worlds, despite every reason she had to doubt him. "Tomorrow, then," she said softly. "Tomorrow." She slipped inside, the door closing between them with a soft click. Elliot stood on the steps for a long moment, looking up at the shabby building, snow falling around him in the gathering dusk. A curtain twitched on the second floor, Mrs. Whitmore perhaps, or Phoebe herself. Watching him stand in the street like a lovesick fool, the thought should have embarrassed him. Instead, he found himself smiling. Tomorrow he would collect the bird from Clarissa. However difficult she made it, however much explanation it required, he would retrieve that mechanical bird if he had to buy it back a dozen times over. Tomorrow he would meet Henry, see Phoebe again, begin to untangle what this pull between them meant. The prospect filled him with more anticipation than he'd felt in years. He turned toward home, pulling his coat tighter against the December cold, his mind already racing ahead to the morning, to Phoebe's laughter echoing in the winter air, to the feel of her hand on his chest, to the way she'd said his name, Elliot, like it was something precious. Tomorrow couldn't come soon enough. Chapter 8. She threw a snowball at an earl's face. Phoebe stared at the ceiling of her small bedroom, watching the pale morning light creep across the plaster, and tried to reconcile this fact with her understanding of herself as a sensible, responsible person who did not do impulsive, ridiculous things. She threw a snowball at the Earl of St. Ives, and then she ran, and he had chased her. Her cheeks burned at the memory. She pressed her hands to her face as if she could physically cool the flush that rose every time she thought about yesterday, which was constantly. She'd thought about little else all night. Sleep had been fitful at best, a confused tangle of dreams where she was running through snow-covered streets, laughing, while a ridiculously handsome earl with auburn hair and dark eyes caught her and said her name in that low, rough voice, "Phoebe." She sat up abruptly, throwing off her blankets. This was absurd. She had things to do. Henry was coming home today. Lord St. Ives was bringing the bird, her grandmother's bird, finally restored. She needed to prepare dinner, tidy the sitting room, make sure Henry's bed was properly aired. She needed to stop mooning about like a foolish girl. Phoebe dressed quickly and moved to the kitchen, determined to focus on practical matters. Toast and tea. Simple. She could manage that without her mind wandering to the way Elliot's hands had felt on her waist when he'd caught her from falling. The way his thumb had brushed along her cheekbone. The way he'd looked at her like the smell of burning made her gasp. She'd left the bread too close to the fire. Again. "Damnation," she muttered, snatching the smoking toast away and waving a cloth at the smoke. "Language, darling." Her mother appeared in the doorway, already dressed, her hair neatly pinned. Cecilia Whitmore possessed the particular talent of looking elegant even in a faded morning gown in a shabby kitchen. Though I confess I'm tempted to say worse. "Is that our breakfast you're incinerating?" I was distracted. Phoebe scraped at the blackened bread, salvaging what she could. "I can see that." Her mother moved to the kettle, taking over the tea preparation with practiced efficiency. "You've been distracted since you came home yesterday. Dreamy-eyed, and you slept poorly. I heard you tossing about all night." Phoebe kept her eyes on the toast. "Henry arrives today. I'm merely anxious to see him." Yes, Henry." Her mother poured hot water over the tea leaves, the familiar domestic ritual somehow soothing. "And it has nothing to do with a certain earl who walked you home yesterday? The one whose carriage caused such a sensation on Bramble Street? Heat flooded Phoebe's face. Mama, Mrs. Henshaw mentioned she saw you in the square near St. Clement's. Cecilia's voice was carefully neutral, but Phoebe could hear the curiosity beneath it. Running, she said, with your cloak flying behind you. Oh God, of course Mrs. Henshaw had seen. Of course she'd told everyone. Phoebe set down the knife and turned to face her mother. I did something foolish. How foolish? I threw a snowball at him. Silence. Then, unexpectedly, her mother laughed. A real laugh, warm and delighted. You threw a snowball at the Earl of St. Ives? It wasn't funny, Mama. It was terribly improper. I'm sure it was. Cecilia's eyes sparkled with amusement. I'm also sure he deserved it. Men of his station usually do. He didn't deserve it. He's been nothing but kind. He's retrieving my grandmother's bird. He walked with me. He listened when I talked about Papa and Henry, and Phoebe stopped herself before she revealed too much. I don't know what came over me. I picked up the snow and threw it before I could think better of it. And then I ran, like a complete fool. And did he chase you? Phoebe nodded mutely. Her mother's smile softened into something more thoughtful. And when he caught you? The memory flooded back, his hands gentle on her arms, both of them breathless and laughing, snow falling around them, the way he'd looked at her like she was something precious and surprising. He wasn't angry, Phoebe said quietly. He said it was the most honest thing anyone had done in his presence in years. Cecilia was quiet for a moment, studying her daughter's face. You like him? It wasn't a question, but Phoebe answered anyway. I barely know him. That's not what I asked. Phoebe turned back to the ruined toast, unable to meet her mother's eyes. It doesn't matter if I like him or not. He's an earl. I'm a music teacher. He'll bring the bird today, and I'll be grateful beyond measure. And then he'll go back to his life in Mayfair, and I'll go back to mine here. That's how these things work. Is it? Her mother's voice held a note Phoebe couldn't quite identify. I seem to recall a baron's daughter who thought the same thing about a music master once, that it couldn't possibly work, that their worlds were too different. That's different, is it? You gave up everything for Papa. Your family, your position, your security. And when he died, Phoebe stopped, the old grief and worry rising up. You've spent the last 10 years struggling because of that choice. I've spent the last 10 years living with the consequences of love, her mother corrected gently. There's a difference, and I would choose your father again, Phoebe. Every time, even knowing how it would end. Phoebe felt her throat tighten. I'm not you, Mama. I can't. I have responsibilities. Henry's education, your health, our rent. I can't throw all that away for what? A snowball fight in December? Her mother's smile was kind. No one is asking you to throw anything away, darling. Least of all yourself. Lord St. Ives is helping you retrieve your grandmother's gift. Be grateful for that. Enjoy his company while it lasts, and if something more comes of it, she shrugged. Life surprises us sometimes. Nothing more will come of it. Perhaps not. Cecilia handed her daughter a cup of tea. But you threw a snowball at an earl yesterday, and by all accounts, he chased you through a public square. So perhaps you're capable of more surprising things than you think. Phoebe took the tea, letting the warmth seep into her hands. I am grateful, she said quietly, for his help with the bird. It means everything to have it back, for Henry to hear it play on Christmas morning, for all of us to have that piece of grandmother with us again. That's what matters. Of course it is. Her mother touched her cheek gently. But it's also all right to enjoy a handsome man's company, even if he is an earl, even if it's only for a little while. He said he'd come today, with the bird. Then you'd better eat something more substantial than charred bread, her mother said practically. And perhaps change your dress. That one has a stain on the sleeve. Mama? What? I'm simply observing that if a gentleman is calling, earl or not, one should look presentable. Cecilia's eyes twinkled. Purely a matter of propriety, you understand. Despite herself, Phoebe laughed. You're incorrigible. I'm pragmatic. Now eat your breakfast, burned though it is, and then help me prepare for Henry's arrival. Your brother will be hungry after his journey, and you know we'll want everything ready when he arrives. Phoebe spent the rest of the morning trying, and largely failing, to focus on preparations for Henry's homecoming. She swept the floors but found herself pausing by the window, looking down at the street. She prepared vegetables for dinner, but kept losing track of what she was doing, her mind wandering to the feel of Elliot's hand on her cheek, the way he'd said her name. "You've peeled that same carrot 3 times," her mother observed from her mending. "There won't be anything left of it if you continue." Phoebe set down the knife. "I can't seem to concentrate." "I noticed." Cecilia bit off a thread. "He'll come or he won't, Phoebe. Watching the window won't change it." "I know," but she looked out the window again anyway. The hours crept by with agonizing slowness. Every sound on the stairs made her heart jump. Every voice in the street below made her crane her neck to see if it was a familiar, tall figure in an expensive greatcoat. But the morning passed into afternoon, and no knock came at their door. By mid-afternoon, Phoebe had nearly convinced herself he wouldn't come at all. That yesterday had been an aberration, a moment out of time that meant nothing in the cold light of day. She was setting the table for dinner when the knock finally came. Her heart leaped so violently she nearly dropped the plates. "I'll get it," she said, her voice not quite steady. Her mother looked up from stirring the pot over the fire, that same knowing smile playing at her lips. "I'm sure you will, dear." Phoebe smoothed her dress, the one without the stain on the sleeve, took a breath to steady herself and opened the door. But it wasn't Elliot standing on their threshold. It was Henry. Elliot arrived at the Penholloam residence at precisely 3 o'clock, as agreed. The same butler who had admitted him on his previous visit opened the door, but this time there was something distinctly uncomfortable in the man's expression, a kind of resigned pity that made Elliot's instincts prickle with warning. "Lady Clarissa is expecting you, my lord," the butler said, his tone carefully neutral. "In the drawing room." The walk through the Penholms' elegant hallways felt longer than it had before. Colder somehow, despite the fires burning in every grate. Lady Clarissa stood by the window when he entered, her back to the door. She didn't turn at his entrance, didn't acknowledge him at all until he'd been standing there for several long, awkward seconds. "Lady Clarissa," he said finally. "Good afternoon." She turned then, slowly, and the expression on her face made him take an involuntary step back. It wasn't anger, precisely. It was something colder, more deliberate. Contempt. "Lord St. Ives," her voice was flat. "How punctual you are. I've come to collect the bird, as we discussed." He kept his tone pleasant, professional. "I trust the repairs were completed?" "Repairs." She laughed. A sharp, brittle sound. "Yes, let's discuss those repairs, shall we?" Something in her tone sent ice sliding down his spine. "Is there a problem?" "Oh, there's no problem at all." She moved to the settee, arranged herself with deliberate grace. "At least, not for me. For you, however." She examined her nails. "I'm afraid I don't have your precious bird." His heart sank. "What do you mean you don't have it?" "Exactly what I said. It's gone." "Gone where? Does it matter?" She looked up at him with cold satisfaction. "I got rid of it, the moment I realized what it meant." He took a careful breath, forcing himself to remain calm. "What did it mean, Clarissa?" "Don't play stupid with me. That ridiculous trinket instead of proper jewelry. Then coming back for it, claiming it was meant for your niece, offering a fan as replacement." Her voice turned hard. The message was clear enough. No proposal, no future. Just the Earl of St. Ives extracting himself from an inconvenient entanglement. "I never promised you anything." "No, you simply let everyone believe you would." She stood abruptly. "But I'm past caring about that now. You want your bird? Too bad. I threw it at the wall the moment I opened the box. Then I had my maid dispose of whatever was left." Horror twisted in his gut. "You threw it." "As hard as I could." It made a very satisfying crash. She smiled then, mean and petty. Considerate payment for wasting my time. He wanted to rage at her, to make her understand what she'd done. But her expression made it clear she understood perfectly and didn't care. "I need to speak with your maid," he said, his voice tight. "Now," she shrugged, "if you must, though I can't imagine what good it will do you." She rang the bell. They waited in tense silence until a young maid appeared, her eyes going wide when she saw Elliot's expression. "Lucy," Clarissa said, her tone bored, "tell Lord St. Ives what you did with that mechanical bird I told you to dispose of." The girl's hands twisted in her apron. "I gave it to my cousin, my lady. It seemed too fine to just throw away, and she said she knew someone who might want it. Your cousin? Elliot forced himself to speak gently despite the urgency clawing at him. Where is she now? She's gone to Yorkshire, my lord, to visit her mother for Christmas. Won't be back until after 12th night. The words hit him like a physical blow. And did she say where she took the bird? Which shop? Lucy's face crumpled with anxiety. No, my lord, just that she sold it somewhere in Cheapside. There's ever so many shops down there that buy curiosities and such. I don't know which one exactly. Somewhere in Cheapside. No way to know which shop. And his only lead was in Yorkshire until after Christmas. The bird was gone. Thank you, Lucy, he managed. You may go. She fled gratefully. Elliot turned back to Clarissa, who was watching him with detached interest. You look quite distressed, my lord. I didn't think you capable of caring about anything that deeply. He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw clearly what he'd been too careless to notice before. The pettiness, the cruelty, the fundamental smallness of spirit that allowed her to destroy something precious simply because she'd been disappointed. I wish you joy of whatever future offers you eventually receive, he said quietly, though I pity the man who makes them. Her face flushed with anger, but he was already turning away. Get out, she spat. Gladly. He left without another word, striding through the elegant halls and out into the December cold. His carriage waited at the curb. Where to, my lord? Bennet asked. Elliot stood on the pavement, his mind churning. Somewhere in Cheapside. Dozens of shops, hundreds of stalls and dealers. The cousin wouldn't return until after 12th night, long after Christmas had passed. Long after he'd promised Phoebe her bird would be restored. The trail was cold, the bird was lost, and he had no idea how to find it. My lord, Bennet prompted gently. Elliot closed his eyes briefly. He'd given his word to Phoebe, promised he would bring the bird today, and now he would have to tell her he'd failed. Bramble Street, he said, his voice heavy. Number 14. The drive across London felt interminable. He stared out the window without seeing the streets pass by, trying to find words that would make this bearable. I'm sorry, I failed you. The bird is gone. Nothing would ease what he was about to do to her. By the time the carriage stopped on Bramble Street, darkness had fallen. Lamplight glowed warm in the windows of number 14. He could hear voices inside, one young and male, full of energy. Henry was home. They were together for Christmas, and he was about to ruin it. Shall I wait, my lord? Bennet asked. Yes. His voice came out rough. I won't be long. How long did it take to break a promise? He climbed the stairs slowly, each step feeling heavier than the last. At the door, he paused, drew a breath. Inside, he could hear them clearly now. Henry's voice, excited, talking about something at school. Phoebe's laugh, warm and affectionate. They sounded happy, content. The truth would shatter that. But he owed her honesty. He'd given his word to come today, and the least he could do was tell her why he'd failed. Elliot raised his hand and knocked. Footsteps switched quickly, light, feminine. The door opened. Phoebe stood there, her face lighting up the moment she saw him. Lord St. Ives, you came. She turned, calling back into the room. Henry, this is Lord St. Ives, the gentleman I told you about. A lanky boy appeared at her shoulder, all long limbs and direct curiosity. He had Phoebe's coloring, her eyes, but where hers were careful, his were open and assessing. Did you get it back? Henry asked immediately, looking past Elliot as if expecting a parcel. The bird? Two pairs of eyes looked at him, one eager and hopeful, one trusting and warm. Elliot opened his mouth to tell them the truth. I'm sorry. I failed you. The bird is gone. The words were right there, ready to be spoken. But looking at Phoebe's face, at the hope in her eyes, the trust, the joy of having her brother home, he found he couldn't do it. Not today. Not when Henry had just arrived. Not when she looked at him like he'd kept his promise. There's been a small delay, he heard himself say. With the repairs, nothing serious, but I'm afraid it needs another day or two. The lie tasted like ash in his mouth. But Phoebe's face showed only mild disappointment, quickly replaced by understanding. Oh, of course. These things take time, I suppose. I'm terribly sorry. I know you were hoping to have it today. It's all right. She smiled at him, smiled even though he was lying to her face. As long as we have it for Christmas, that's what matters. Won't you come in? We were just about to have tea, and I'd love for you to meet Henry properly. He should refuse, should leave, should tell her the truth right now before the lie grew any larger. But Henry was looking at him with open curiosity, and Phoebe's smile was so warm, so welcoming, and the thought of walking away, of not seeing her, of admitting his failure, "I'd be delighted," he heard himself say. And as he stepped across the threshold into their shabby, warm rooms, his mind began to race. Cheapside, every shop, every dealer, every stall that sold curiosities and mechanical trinkets. He had no idea which one had the bird, no way to narrow the search. But he had time, a few days until Christmas. He had money. He had determination. And now, having lied to her face, having promised her the bird would be ready soon, he had no choice. He would find it. Somehow. He had to. Chapter 9. Phoebe woke to the sound of Henry's laughter drifting through the thin walls, a sound she'd missed more than she'd realized during his months away at school. She lay still for a moment, letting the warmth of it settle over her like a blanket, before the other sound registered. A deeper voice. Male. Amused. Lord St. Ives was already here. She sat up abruptly, her heart doing something foolish and entirely too quick. The morning light slanting through her window suggested it was later than she'd thought. Past 9, certainly. She'd overslept, and he was in the next room, probably drinking tea with her mother and entertaining Henry with some story that made her brother laugh like that. She dressed quickly, fingers fumbling with buttons that had never given her trouble before. Her hair refused to cooperate, strands escaping her pins to curl around her face, no matter how firmly she tried to secure them. Finally, she gave up, settled for mostly neat, and emerged from her bedroom with what she hoped was appropriate composure. Her mother glanced up from her mending, Henry twisted in his chair with a grin, and Elliot rose smoothly to his feet, that fluid grace she was beginning to recognize as particular to him. "Good morning," she said, acutely aware that her hair was escaping its pins and she probably had sleep creases on her face, and why did any of that matter? "I didn't realize you'd arrived." "Only just," he said, though Henry's comfort suggested otherwise. "I hope it's not too early?" "Lord St. Ives has been telling me about the racehorses at Newmarket," Henry announced. "Did you know they can run a mile in under 2 minutes? That's faster than your sister's patience with horse racing discussion before breakfast," Cecilia interjected smoothly. "Phoebe, dear, there's tea, and Lord St. Ives has kindly offered to accompany you to the market this morning if you're still planning to do the Christmas shopping." Phoebe's gaze snapped to Elliot. "That's not necessary. I'm perfectly capable of—" "I'm sure you are," he said, "but I'd enjoy the outing if you'll have me, and Henry mentioned he'd like to come along." "Can I, Phoebe? Please?" Her brother's eyes went wide with the particular pleading expression he'd perfected at age 6. "I've been stuck inside or at school for months. I'll carry everything, I promise." She looked at the three of them, Henry eager, her mother carefully neutral, Elliot waiting with that slight smile that suggested he knew perfectly well she wanted to refuse and was curious whether she would. "Fine," she heard herself say, "but we need to leave soon. The best stalls will be picked over by midday." 20 minutes later, they were walking through streets that sparkled with fresh snow and the particular energy that preceded Christmas. Henry bounded ahead, then circled back, then ran ahead again like an overexcited puppy. Phoebe found herself smiling despite the awkwardness of having Elliot St. Ives walking beside her through her neighborhood in broad daylight, where anyone might see, where everyone definitely would see. "He has remarkable energy," Elliot observed, watching Henry investigate a shop window 3 doors ahead. "He's been confined to school routines for months. This is freedom." She pulled her cloak tighter against the cold. "Though I appreciate you volunteering to help carry things. He will, and then he'll complain about it the entire way home. Will he? Constantly, but he'll still do it. He's good that way." They walked in comfortable silence for a moment. Then, "You slept late this morning." Heat crept up her neck. "I don't usually. Last night I couldn't." She stopped herself before admitting she'd lain awake replaying every moment of the previous day. His arrival at their door, the disappointment about the delay with the bird quickly replaced by his assurance it would be ready soon. The way he'd looked when Henry asked about it, something in his expression she couldn't quite read, regret, perhaps, at not having it ready yet. The warmth in his voice when he'd promised before Christmas, the way he'd said her brother's name. I was restless. I'm sorry if my news about the delay upset you. No, it's fine. These things happen. She glanced at him. You'll have it soon, though, the bird? Yes. The word came out firm, almost fierce. Before Christmas, I give you my word. She believed him. That was the problem. Or perhaps the gift. She believed him completely. The market square was already crowded when they arrived, a riot of color and sound and smell that always made Phoebe's head spin slightly. Vendors called out their wares. Children darted between stalls. The scent of roasting chestnuts and mulled wine mixed with less pleasant odors of unwashed bodies and animal dung. Henry disappeared immediately toward a toy stall. Phoebe moved through the familiar chaos with practiced efficiency, comparing prices, testing the weight of vegetables, calculating exactly how much she could afford to spend while still having enough left for emergencies. She was negotiating over a goose, trying to get the butcher down by 3p, when small voices shrieked her name. Miss Phoebe! Miss Phoebe! She turned to find Betsy and two of her siblings weaving through the crowd, their mother following at a more sedate pace with a market basket. Happy Christmas Eve, Miss Phoebe! Betsy launched herself at Phoebe's skirts with the enthusiasm of the very young. Are you buying your Christmas goose? We already got ours, and Mama says I can help stuff it. How wonderful, Phoebe said, smoothing the girl's hair back from her face. And have you been practicing your scales? Every day. Well, almost every day, except Thursday when I had a cold, but mostly every day. That's my good girl. The other children crowded close, chattering over each other, and Phoebe found herself answering questions and laughing at their excitement until she realized Elliot had stepped back slightly, giving them space. He watched the exchange with that same slight smile, and when Betsy finally noticed him, her eyes went round. Is that your fancy lord again? She whispered, though her whisper carried clearly. That's Lord St. Ives, Phoebe confirmed. You remember him from the other day. He's very tall, Betsy announced. Then, with no sense of propriety whatsoever, are you going to marry him? Betsy! Mrs. Miller appeared, breathless and mortified. I'm so sorry, Miss Whitmore. She doesn't mean. Children have no sense of. It's quite all right, Phoebe said, though her face felt like it might catch fire. Lord St. Ives, you remember Mrs. Miller? And her children, Betsy, Tom, and little Margaret. Elliot bowed, actually bowed to the children, which made Betsy giggle and Tom straighten importantly. A pleasure to see you all again. Betsy, I understand you've been practicing your scales admirably. Miss Phoebe says I'm getting much better, Betsy said proudly. I don't doubt it. He crouched down to Betsy's level, putting himself at eye height with the little girl. What are you hoping Father Christmas brings you? Betsy launched into an elaborate description involving a doll and a new bonnet, and possibly a pony, though she knew the pony was probably too much to hope for. Elliot listened with apparent genuine interest, asking questions, making the appropriate impressed noises. Phoebe watched him, something in her chest going tight. He didn't have to do this, didn't have to crouch in the muddy snow and listen to a 7-year-old's rambling wish list. Didn't have to look at Betsy like she was a real person whose thoughts mattered rather than just another merchant's daughter to be tolerated. But he did it anyway. When Mrs. Miller finally extracted her children and moved on, with many apologies and backward glances, Elliot straightened and caught Phoebe staring at him. What? He asked. Nothing. You're just... She searched for words that wouldn't reveal too much. Good with children. They're easier than adults, I find, more honest about what they want. And what they think of you, she added. Betsy has no filter whatsoever. She's delightful. He said it like he meant it. They moved on through the market. Phoebe bought vegetables, a small ham, flour for tomorrow's bread. Elliot carried her parcels without being asked, and when she tried to take them from him, he simply held them higher, out of reach, with a grin that made him look years younger. I'm perfectly capable of carrying my own purchases, she informed him. I never doubted it, but Henry specifically promised to help, and I'd hate to see him fail in his duties. He glanced ahead to where her brother was examining something at a bookseller's stall. Besides, you might need your hands free. For what? For whatever else you need to buy. Surely there's more? There was. Always more. But she'd allocated every shilling carefully, and she'd reached the limit of what she could spend without dipping into her emergency funds. I have what I need, she said. His expression suggested he didn't quite believe her, but he didn't push. They found Henry at the bookseller's stall, turning the pages of a book with careful reverence. When he saw them approaching, he set it down quickly. Ready to go? His voice was carefully casual. Phoebe glanced at the book he'd been examining. A natural history of British birds, beautifully illustrated, the kind of book she could never afford to buy him. In a moment, she said. Let me just look at. She moved to a different stall, giving Henry a chance to look at his book a moment longer without her hovering. When she glanced back a few minutes later, Henry had moved on, and Elliot was speaking quietly with the bookseller. She couldn't hear what they were saying, but she saw the bookseller nod, saw Elliot's hand move toward his coat, saw coins pass between them with the smooth efficiency of a transaction completed. The bookseller picked up the book Henry had been examining, began to wrap it. Elliot said something else, too low to hear. The bookseller grinned, nodded again. Tomorrow morning, she caught. From Father Christmas. Her throat went tight. Elliot turned then and found her watching him. For a moment, they simply looked at each other across the crowded market. His expression was difficult to read, or maybe she was reading too much into it, something that looked like he'd been caught doing something he wasn't ashamed of, but also hadn't wanted her to witness. She should say something, should tell him he didn't need to buy Henry's affection, should remind him they weren't charity cases. But the words wouldn't come, because he wasn't doing it for credit. Wasn't doing it so she would thank him or Henry would know who to be grateful to. He was doing it because he'd seen her brother's face when he looked at that book, because he could help, and so he had, without expectation of recognition, without making a show of his generosity, just quietly, kindly. She looked away first, her eyes stinging in a way that had nothing to do with the cold wind. When he rejoined her a moment later, neither of them spoke of it, but something had shifted. Something she couldn't quite name but felt acutely, like a key turning in a lock she hadn't known was there. They collected Henry and began the walk home, laden with parcels. Her brother chattered about the market, about the toy soldiers he'd seen, about everything and nothing. Phoebe let his voice wash over her, while her mind stayed caught on that moment. The book, the quiet transaction, the way Elliot had looked at her when he'd been discovered. "What are you thinking about?" Elliot asked quietly, during a brief pause in Henry's monologue. "Nothing," she lied. "That's the second time you've told me nothing when something was clearly occupying your thoughts. Perhaps I'm entitled to my private thoughts." "Of course you are," his voice was gentle. "But you're also terrible at hiding when something's bothering you. Your face shows everything." "It does not." "It does. Right now, for instance, you're annoyed that I've pointed out you can't dissemble effectively." She was. How did he know that? "And now," he continued, clearly enjoying himself, "you're trying to decide whether to be more annoyed or impressed that I can read you so easily. Impressed is certainly not what I'm feeling." Liar. The word was said with such warm amusement that she couldn't help smiling despite herself. "You're insufferable. So you've mentioned." They walked a few more steps. Then, "But you're smiling now." She was. When had that happened? They were nearly home when Henry suddenly grabbed her arm. "Oh, I forgot to tell you. Mrs. Davies said their daughter Lucy is home from her position, and she has a pianoforte, and she said I should ask if you'd come play something for them." "I said I'd ask, so I'm asking. Can we? Please?" Phoebe's stomach clenched. "Henry, I'm sure Mrs. Davies was just being polite." "She wasn't. She specifically said she'd love to hear you play. And Lord St. Ives hasn't heard you really play, only heard you teach." Henry turned to Elliot with the earnestness of youth. "She's brilliant, truly, better than any of the teachers at school." "Henry, I would very much like to hear you play," Elliot said quietly, "if you're willing." She looked at him, at the genuine interest in his expression, at the way he was looking at her, like the answer actually mattered to him. "It's been a long time since I played for anyone but students," she hedged. "Then you're overdue." How did he make it sound so simple? As if performing weren't terrifying, as if she weren't about to expose something vulnerable and true about herself to someone whose opinion had begun to matter far too much. "Please, Phoebe?" Henry's eyes were pleading. She sighed. "Fine, but only if Mrs. Davies truly doesn't mind the intrusion." Henry whooped and ran ahead to ask, leaving her and Elliot alone on the street with their parcels. "You don't have to do this if it makes you uncomfortable," Elliot said. "I know, but you're going to anyway. Apparently." They looked at each other. Snow had begun to fall again, light flakes drifting down to catch in his hair, on his shoulders. He'd been walking through her neighborhood all morning, carrying her parcels like a footman, crouching in the mud to talk to children, buying books for her brother in secret, and now he was offering her an escape from something that terrified her while simultaneously hoping she wouldn't take it. And she was going to play for him. She was going to sit at a pianoforte and bear something essential about herself, and he would watch, and she had no idea what would happen after. "You're thinking again," he observed. "Can't seem to help it today. Anything you'd care to share?" "Yes, no, everything, nothing." "I'm thinking," she said carefully, "that this is a very strange Christmas Eve. Strange good or strange bad? I haven't decided yet." His smile was soft. It looked like understanding, though she couldn't be certain. "Fair enough." Henry came running back, breathless. "She says yes. She'd be honored. She's making tea. Come on." He grabbed Phoebe's hand and pulled her forward. She barely had time to glance back at Elliot before Henry was dragging her toward Mrs. Davies's building. But she felt Elliot following behind them, felt his presence like a warmth at her back. And when they climbed the stairs to the Davies' rooms, small but neat, the pianoforte old but beautifully maintained in the corner, and Mrs. Davies welcomed them with the warm enthusiasm Phoebe had come to know well over the years, she realized something with sudden clarity. She was about to play for him, really play. Not the careful, simplified pieces she taught her students, but something real. Something that came from that place inside her where music lived. And he would see her, not the struggling teacher or the proud woman trying to hold her family together, just her. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, as she removed her gloves and moved toward the instrument, she found she wanted him to see, wanted him to understand what she couldn't say with words. The keys were cool under her fingers. She tested them gently, found them reasonably in tune. Behind her, she heard Mrs. Davies offering tea, Henry settling into a chair, the rustle of fabric as Elliot sat down. She didn't look back at him, couldn't. If she saw his face, saw his expectation, she might lose her nerve entirely. Instead, she closed her eyes, let her fingers find their places, and began to play. Elliot had attended more musical performances than he could count. Operas at Covent Garden where sopranos with trained voices sang arias that brought audiences to tears. Private concerts in grand drawing rooms where acclaimed pianists performed for select gatherings. His mother had insisted he develop an appreciation for the arts, and so he had dutifully attended, applauded at appropriate moments, and forgotten the performances almost immediately after. He'd never understood what people meant when they said music moved them, until now. Phoebe sat at the worn pianoforte in Mrs. Davies's small parlor, her back straight, her hands poised over the keys. For a moment she was utterly still, eyes closed, and he found himself holding his breath without quite knowing why. Then she began to play. The first notes were soft, almost tentative, a simple melody that reminded him of something he couldn't quite place. A folk song, perhaps. Something old and familiar. But then her hands moved faster, the melody shifting into something more complex, more urgent, and he realized she wasn't playing anything he'd heard before. She was creating, letting the music flow from some place inside her he hadn't known existed. He'd thought he'd begun to know her. The fierce pride, the determination, the way she calculated every penny and carried the weight of her family on her shoulders without complaint. He'd seen her with her students, patient and encouraging. He'd seen her with Henry, loving and protective. He'd seen her throw a snowball and run laughing through the snow. But this was something else entirely. Her whole body moved with the music, not dramatically, not for show, but with small, unconscious movements. Her shoulders swayed slightly, her head tilted. Her fingers flew over the keys with a grace and certainty that suggested this was where she truly lived. not in shabby rooms in Bramble Street, not teaching scales to shopkeepers' daughters. Here, in the music, the melody soared and dipped, turned playful and then melancholy, built to something that made his chest feel too tight. She hit a wrong note, just one, barely noticeable, and he saw her flinch slightly. But she didn't stop, didn't apologize or start over. She simply kept playing, weaving the error into the melody as if it had been intentional all along. She played like she spoke when her guard was down, with fierce honesty and carefully controlled passion. But at the piano, the control fell away completely. This was who she was when no one was watching, when she didn't have to be strong or responsible or careful. This was Phoebe without armor. The music shifted again, slower now, sadder. It reminded him of snow falling at twilight, of empty rooms and letters never sent, of things lost and never recovered. She was playing about grief, about the father she'd lost and the life that had disappeared with him, about the grandmother who had left her a mechanical bird and words about making joy. She was playing everything she couldn't say, and he finally understood what it meant for music to reach inside your chest and rearrange something fundamental. The melody resolved into something simpler, quieter, a few final notes that hung in the air like a question, then silence. Phoebe's hands remained on the keys, her eyes still closed, as if reluctant to return to the ordinary world. Her chest rose and fell with deep breaths. A strand of dark hair had escaped its pins to curl against her neck. She was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. "Bravo!" Mrs. Davies exclaimed, breaking the spell. "That was magnificent, my dear. Simply magnificent." "That was brilliant, Phoebe." Henry bounced in his chair. "Play something else." Phoebe's eyes opened. She turned slightly, and her gaze found his. She looked uncertain, vulnerable, waiting. He should say something, should tell her. What? That she'd just turned his entire world sideways? That he'd never heard anything more beautiful? That watching her play had made him feel things he had no right to feel? His voice came out rough. He cleared his throat. "You're extraordinary. Not adequate. Not even close. But all he could manage." Color flooded her cheeks. "It's been a while since I played for anyone. I'm terribly out of practice, I'm afraid." "If that's out of practice," Mrs. Davies said, pouring tea, "I shudder to think what you could do with proper preparation. Henry, dear, would you help me bring the cups?" Henry was already talking about another piece as he followed Mrs. Davies to the tea service, but Elliot barely heard. His mind was reeling. This woman who'd pawned her most precious possession to bring her brother home, who taught children with endless patience, who threw snowballs and counted pennies and played music that could break your heart, and he was lying to her. The thought crashed through him like cold water. She'd just given him something precious, this glimpse of her unguarded self, vulnerable and true. And he was lying to her face, had looked her in the eyes this morning and lied while she trusted him completely. Her grandmother's gift. He'd promised to return it before Christmas. Christmas was tomorrow. The realization hit him like a fist to the gut. Not tomorrow night, tomorrow morning, hours away. And he had no idea where to even begin looking. His gaze snapped to the window. The light was already fading toward dusk. 5 o'clock? Later? The afternoon had vanished while he'd been walking through markets and watching her play and forgetting that he'd made a promise he had no way to keep. Panic clawed up his throat. Somewhere in Cheapside, dozens of shops, hundreds of stalls, sold days ago to a cousin who'd gone to Yorkshire. No way to know which shop, which dealer, which... He stood abruptly. The chair scraped harsh against the floor. Everyone looked at him, Mrs. Davies with a teacup suspended mid-pour, Henry confused, and Phoebe, still at the piano, her face flushed from playing, her eyes wide and questioning. "I must go." The words came out strangled. There's something urgent." "Is everything all right, my lord?" Mrs. Davies set down the teapot with concern. "Yes, I apologize. I've just remembered something that requires my immediate attention." "Oh?" Phoebe's voice was small. "Of course." He saw something flicker across her face. Hurt? Confusion? She was trying to understand why he'd stood up so abruptly, was practically fleeing the room. "Miss Whitmore, that was..." He gestured helplessly toward the piano. Words failed him entirely. How could he possibly express what he'd just felt? I've never." "Thank you," he managed finally. "For playing, it was beautiful." Such an inadequate word for what he'd just witnessed. "I'm glad you enjoyed it," she said quietly, but her hands had curled into small fists in her lap. "Henry." He turned to the boy, desperate to escape the confusion in Phoebe's eyes. "Thank you for today. Excellent company." "Are you coming tomorrow?" Henry asked. "For Christmas? You said you'd bring—" "I don't know, perhaps I have something I must." He was making it worse with every word. "I'm sorry, I must go. Mrs. Davies, thank you, Miss Whitmore." He met her gaze one more time, saw the hurt she was trying to hide behind dignity. "I'm sorry," he said, "for the lie, for leaving like this, for not having the words to explain." Then he turned and left before he could make it worse. He took the stairs two at a time, burst out onto the street, where snow was falling again in the dusk. His breath came fast, not from exertion but from panic finally given voice. Tomorrow was Christmas. He'd promised, and he had no idea where to start. Simon. He needed Simon. Elliot turned toward Brook Street, walking fast, then faster, his mind already racing ahead. They could start tonight, right now. Even if shops were closing, someone might remember the bird, might know where it had gone. There had to be a trail, however cold. They had tonight. All of Christmas Eve, if necessary. And if they didn't find it, no. He couldn't think about failure. Couldn't imagine facing Phoebe tomorrow empty-handed after she'd looked at him with such trust and said, "As long as we have it for Christmas." After she'd played for him like that. After she'd shown him her soul. The snow fell harder as he walked, his expensive boots slipping slightly on the icy cobblestones. Around him, London was settling in for Christmas Eve. Families visible through lit windows, the smell of roasting meat, the sound of laughter and singing. He barely noticed. All he could see was Phoebe's face when he'd stood to leave. The confusion, the hurt she'd tried to hide. She thought she'd done something wrong, thought her playing had driven him away, when the truth was her playing had shown him exactly what he stood to lose if he failed her now. By the time he reached Brook Street, his mind was made up. He'd get Simon. They'd go to Cheapside tonight, search every shop that was still open. Tomorrow they'd start again at dawn. They wouldn't stop until they found it, or until he had to face her and admit he'd lied. He couldn't let that happen. Wouldn't. He'd find that damned bird if he had to tear Cheapside apart stone by stone. He almost believed it was possible. Chapter 10. The small kitchen was warm and fragrant when Phoebe arrived home, her mother already elbow-deep in bread dough at the table. Henry immediately dove for the mince pies cooling on the rack. "Hands off those," Cecilia said without looking up. "They're for tomorrow. How was Mrs. Davies? Did you play?" "She did," Henry announced through a mouthful of pie he'd snagged anyway. "And she was brilliant. Lord St. Ives looked completely mesmerized." "Henry, I said those were for tomorrow." But Cecilia was smiling. Her gaze shifted to Phoebe. "And where's Lord St. Ives now?" "He had to leave." Phoebe hung up her cloak, avoiding her mother's eyes. "Some urgent business." "On Christmas Eve?" Cecilia's hands stilled on the dough. "How odd." "Yes." Phoebe moved to the basin to wash her hands. "What needs doing?" "The goose wants stuffing." Phoebe pulled the bird toward her and began working breadcrumbs and herbs into the cavity with more force than necessary. Behind her, she felt her mother's attention like a weight. "Phoebe?" "What happened?" "Nothing happened. I played, he listened, then he left." She kept her eyes on the goose. "That's all." Cecilia was quiet for a moment. "Did he say why?" "Just that he had urgent business." Phoebe's hands stilled. "But the way he left, he practically ran from the room, Mama. We saw one moment he was watching me, and the next he couldn't get out fast enough. Perhaps something truly urgent. Maybe." But Phoebe didn't believe it, and from her mother's tone, neither did she. She returned to the goose, stuffing it with sharp, deliberate movements. Her mind wouldn't stop circling. Had she done something wrong? Said something? The music had felt right while she was playing, honest and true, but maybe that was the problem. "Stop," Cecilia said quietly. Phoebe looked up. "Whatever you're thinking, stop." Her mother's expression was gentle but firm. "Tomorrow he'll bring the bird as promised. That's what matters." Phoebe nodded, throat tight. They finished the preparations in silence, the goose ready for roasting, mince pies cooling, vegetables chopped and waiting. Henry chattered about tomorrow while Phoebe's hands moved through familiar tasks, her mind elsewhere. He'd looked at her like she was something extraordinary. Then he'd fled. Tomorrow he would come with the bird. He'd promised. And whatever had happened today, whatever she'd done or revealed or made him see, didn't matter. It couldn't matter. She almost believed it. Simon Hartley was tying his cravat when someone began pounding on his door as if the building were on fire. "Good God," he muttered, abandoning the mirror and heading downstairs. His butler had already gone home for the holiday, leaving Simon to answer his own door like a commoner. He pulled it open, ready to deliver a scathing rebuke to whoever. Elliot St. Ives stood on his doorstep, snow-covered and wild-eyed. "I need your help," Elliot said without preamble. "Now." Simon took in his friend's appearance. Hair disheveled, coat buttoned wrong, the look of a man who'd either lost his mind or was about to. "What's happened? Is someone dead?" "No, worse." Elliot pushed past him into the hall. "I need to find the mechanical bird, the one from the pawn shop." "The one you bought for Lady Clarissa?" "Yes, I need to find it, tonight." Simon closed the door slowly, his mind working. "Elliot, it's Christmas Eve. You sent that bird to Clarissa days ago." "I know. It's complicated." Elliot was already heading for the door again. "Are you coming or not?" "Coming where?" "Cheapside." "Cheapside." Simon stared at him. "On Christmas Eve, in a snowstorm, to find a mechanical bird you already gave away." "Yes." "Have you gone mad?" "Probably." Elliot's jaw was tight. "But I need your help anyway. Please, Simon." Simon looked at his friend, truly looked at him, the desperation in his eyes, the barely controlled panic. Whatever this was about, it mattered. More than Simon had seen anything matter to Elliot in years. "Fine." He grabbed his greatcoat from the hook. "But you're explaining everything, and I mean everything on the way." "Agreed. And if this involves breaking any laws, I want it noted that I'm doing this under duress." "Noted." They climbed into Elliot's carriage, and the moment the door closed, Simon turned to him. "Talk. Now, why are we hunting for a bird you gave to Lady Clarissa?" "I didn't give it to her. I sent it to her. There's a difference, Elliot. The bird belonged to someone else originally, a woman named Miss Whitmore. She pawned it to pay for her brother's school fees." The words came out in a rush. "I bought it at the pawn shop. You were there, remember? I thought it would be perfect for Clarissa. So I sent it to her. And then Miss Whitmore came to redeem it, found out I'd bought it." Elliot dragged a hand through his hair. "She appeared at my door and demanded I return it, said it was her grandmother's, the only thing she had left of her family." Simon's eyebrows rose. "She appeared at your door. Stormed into my foyer, actually. This woman stormed into the Earl of St. Ives' foyer and demanded her property back." "Yes. I like her already." Simon settled back against the seat, grinning despite the situation. "Go on." "I promised I'd get it back. Went to Clarissa to retrieve it." Elliot's expression darkened. "She'd thrown it at a wall, told her maid to get rid of it." "Christ. The maid gave it to her cousin, who sold it to a shop somewhere in Cheapside. We don't know which one." Simon absorbed this. "So you promised this woman you'd return her grandmother's bird, discovered it's been sold to an unknown shop in one of the largest commercial districts in London, and now you're—" He stopped. "Wait, when did you promise to return it?" "Before Christmas." "Elliot, Christmas is tomorrow." "I know." "Does she know it's lost?" Elliot was quiet for a moment too long. "Oh no," Simon said. "You didn't." "I told her there was a small delay with repairs." "You lied to her. I thought I could find it in time. And instead, you're searching Cheapside on Christmas Eve in a snowstorm." Simon studied his friend's profile. "Tell me about her." "What? Miss Whitmore, the one who stormed your foyer. Tell me about her." "There's nothing to tell. She's a music teacher, lives in Bramble Street with her mother and brother. She needed the bird back for Christmas." "And? And what? And you're tearing through London in a panic on Christmas Eve." Simon's voice was mild. "So I'll ask again. Tell me about her." Elliot was quiet for a long moment, watching the snow-covered streets pass by. "She's fierce," he said finally, "and proud. She counts every penny and carries her entire family on her shoulders without complaint. She teaches music to shopkeepers' children and plays the pianoforte like—" He stopped. "Like what?" "Like nothing I've ever heard." Elliot's voice had gone soft. "Today she played for me, really played, and it was—" He couldn't find words adequate for what it had been. "Extraordinary?" Simon supplied. "Yes. And you're in love with her. I'm not. Elliot caught Simon's expression and fell silent. You're in love with her, Simon said again, not a question this time. The music teacher from Bramble Street who stormed your house. You're in love with her, and now you're trying to make it right. Elliot stared out the window. Does it matter? Then we'd better find that bird. Simon leaned forward, suddenly all business. Tell me everything. How many curiosities shops could there be in Cheapside? Dozens. Wonderful. Simon settled back. This should be a delightful evening. The carriage rolled into Cheapside, and Elliot's heart sank. Most of the shops were dark, shuttered for the holiday. The few that still showed light were clearly closing up, shopkeepers eager to get home to their families. Snow fell heavily now, making the streets treacherous and visibility poor. There, Elliot pointed to a shop with a faded sign reading Curiosities and Antiquities. A dim light showed through the window. They climbed down into the snow and approached. Elliot knocked. No answer. He knocked harder. The door opened a crack. A suspicious eye peered out. We're closed. Please, I'm looking for a mechanical bird. Don't have one. Try Marsh Street. The door slammed shut. Elliot stood in the snow, staring at the closed door. Excellent start, Simon observed. Only 40 or 50 more shops to go. Simon, I'm merely noting that this may take a while. Simon turned up his collar against the snow. Lead on, fearless hunter of mechanical birds. They trudged through the snow to the next shop. This one was still open, an elderly woman sweeping the floor inside. She looked up when they entered, bells jangling. Help you, gentlemen. We're looking for a mechanical bird, Elliot said. Gold cage, plays music. It would have been sold to a shop in this area in the last few days. The woman shook her head. Haven't had anything like that come through here. Try Morrison's, 2 streets over. They deal more in mechanical items. Thank you. Elliot was already heading for the door. Outside, Simon brushed snow from his shoulders. 2 streets over, through a blizzard, on Christmas Eve. This is going splendidly. If you'd rather go home and miss this, never. Simon grinned. But someone needs to document this disaster for posterity. Morrison's was closed, completely dark. Elliot pounded on the door anyway, desperation overriding sense. No one answered. Shocking, Simon said. It's almost as if people want to be home with their families on Christmas Eve. There has to be someone. Elliot looked up and down the street. Another shop, sign barely legible through the snow. There? This shop was open, but only just. The proprietor was clearly in the process of locking up. He looked irritated when they pushed through the door. We're closed. Please, Elliot said. Just one question. Have you seen a mechanical bird? Gold cage, plays greensleeves? The man paused, considering. Mechanical bird, you say? Yes. Hope surged in Elliot's chest. Had 1 month ago. Beautiful piece. Sold it in September. The hope died. Nothing more recent? No. Try Harwell's, or maybe Finch's down on Cat Street. They deal in musical items sometimes. Thank you. Elliot turned to leave. Harwell's will be closed, though, the man called after them. Won't open till after Boxing Day. Outside, the cold hit them like a wall. Elliot's hands were numb despite his gloves. Snow had soaked through his boots. Beside him, Simon was beginning to look less amused and more concerned. Elliot, Simon said quietly, most of these shops are closed. The ones that are open don't have it. Perhaps we should. No, Elliot started walking. There's still Finch's. Cat Street, he said. And if Finch's is closed, then we keep looking. Until when? Until we've frozen to death in Cheapside? Until we've knocked on every door in London? If necessary. Simon caught his arm, stopping him. She must be remarkable. Elliot met his friend's eyes. She is. To make you do this? Simon studied his face. Very well. Lead on. But if I lose any toes to frostbite, you're explaining it to my valet. Cat Street was narrow and poorly lit. They nearly missed the shop, a small storefront with a weathered sign reading T. Finch, Curiosities. The windows were dark. Wonderful, Simon muttered. Another closed shop. What a surprise. But Elliot had seen something, a flicker of light from the back of the shop. Someone was still inside. He pounded on the door. We're closed, a voice called. Come back after Boxing Day. Please, Elliot shouted. It's urgent. Everything's urgent on Christmas Eve. But footsteps approached. The door opened a crack, revealing an elderly man with a suspicious expression. What's so urgent it can't wait for? He stopped, taking in Elliot's quality coat and desperate expression. What do you want? A mechanical bird, Elliot said quickly. Gold cage, plays music. It would have been brought to you in the last few days. The man, Finch, presumably, squinted at him. What's it to you? It belongs to someone who needs it back, desperately. Please, do you have it? Finch scratched his chin, clearly weighing whether to help or slam the door. Simon stepped forward, a coin appearing in his hand with practiced ease. We'd be very grateful for any information, Simon said smoothly. And it is Christmas Eve, after all. The coin disappeared into Finch's hand, and his expression softened slightly. A mechanical bird, you said? Gold cage? Yes. German-made, plays greensleeves. The cage might be dented. Ah, Finch nodded slowly. I remember that one. Beautiful piece. Cage was a bit dented when it came in, but the mechanism was sound. Elliot's heart leaped into his throat. Do you still have it? No. Sold it yesterday, matter of fact. The hope crashed. To whom? Let me think. Finch tapped his temple. Gentleman, well-dressed, quality coat like yours, said he was shopping for his daughter. Bought several items. A name, Elliot said, trying to keep his voice steady. Did you get a name? An address? Don't recall offhand, but Finch considered. Wait here. He disappeared back into the shop, leaving them standing in the cold. Snow continued to fall, thick and silent. Elliot's breath came in visible puffs. We're close, Simon said quietly, all teasing gone from his voice. Or we're at another dead end. Have faith. Finch returned with a ledger, squinting at entries by the light from his doorway. Here, Mr. James Hartwell gave his address for delivery of the larger items. He read it out slowly. Elliot committed every word to memory. Thank you so much. Hope you find it, Finch called as they hurried back toward the carriage. And Happy Christmas! They were moving before the carriage door had fully closed, Elliot giving the address to Bennett with barely controlled urgency. We have it, Simon said as they pulled away from Cheapside. An actual lead. If he still has it. If he hasn't already wrapped it. If Elliot... Simon's voice was firm. One problem at a time. First, we get to this address. Then we figure out the rest. The carriage moved through snowy streets, heading back toward the fashionable neighborhoods. For the first time since he'd left Phoebe's side, Elliot felt something close to had a name. They had an address. They might actually find it. The thought filled him with desperate, fragile optimism as they headed toward Mr. James Hartwell's home. He wasn't too late. Not yet. Chapter 11. The church bells were still ringing when they emerged into the snowy night, their sound clear and bright across the quiet streets. Carolers had gathered in the churchyard, voices rising in harmony. God rest ye merry gentlemen, the holly and the ivy. Henry immediately joined a group of boys, adding his enthusiastic if slightly off-key voice to theirs. Lovely service, Mrs. Miller said, appearing at Phoebe's elbow with her usual cheery bustle. Nothing like Christmas Eve to remind us what matters, eh? Indeed, Cecilia agreed. And Miss Whitmore. Mrs. Miller's eyes sparkled with mischief. I do hope you have a very Merry Christmas, with all your recent excitement. Excitement, Phoebe asked carefully. Well, your gentleman friend, of course, the Earl. Mrs. Miller leaned in conspiratorially. Half the street's been talking about it. Lord St. Ives walking you home, calling on you. Quite the scandal. Though I say good for you, dear. She winked. I do hope you get him for Christmas. She bustled off before Phoebe could respond, leaving her standing frozen in the churchyard. Your gentleman friend, I do hope you get him for Christmas. The words echoed in Phoebe's head as they walked home through streets full of Christmas cheer, neighbors calling greetings, children running ahead, light glowing in windows. Henry chattered about tomorrow while Cecilia responded with easy warmth. And Phoebe realized with startling, unwelcome clarity she wanted to see Lord St. Ives tomorrow. Not because of the bird, because of him. The thought should have been absurd. He was an earl. She was a music teacher who counted every penny. They lived in different worlds, but walking through the snowy streets toward home, listening to Henry's excitement and her mother's gentle responses, Phoebe couldn't deny the truth sitting heavy in her chest. Tomorrow he would come, or he wouldn't. And what she was hoping for had nothing to do with a mechanical bird. The house was exactly what Elliot had expected, a well-maintained townhouse in a respectable part of Mayfair, lights glowing warmly in the windows despite the late hour. A family still awake on Christmas Eve, probably finishing their preparations for tomorrow. Tomorrow, when a little girl would unwrap a mechanical bird that belonged to someone else. "Here we are," Simon said as the carriage stopped. "Now what? Now we ask for it back." "Just like that?" "Excuse me, sir, I know it's nearly midnight on Christmas Eve, but I need that gift you bought for your daughter, if necessary." Simon gave him a long look. "You really are in love with her." Elliot didn't answer. He was already climbing down into the snow. The walk to the front door felt longer than it should have. Behind him, Simon followed with considerably less enthusiasm. Elliot raised his hand and knocked. Footsteps approached. The door opened to reveal a butler whose expression suggested this was not a welcome interruption. "May I help you, sir?" "I need to speak with Mr. Hartwell. It's urgent." The butler's eyebrow rose slightly. "The family is not receiving visitors. It's Christmas Eve. I understand, but perhaps you could return after the holiday. Good evening, sir." The door began to close. "Wait." Elliot put his hand against the door. "Please, it's about an item he purchased, a mechanical bird. It's desperately important that I—" "Good evening, sir." The door shut firmly. Elliot stood staring at the closed door, snow falling around him. "Well," Simon said, "that went splendidly. We have to try again." "Elliot, the man's butler just shut the door in your face. What do you think will happen if you knock again?" "I don't care." But before he could knock, Simon caught his arm. "Look." He pointed toward the side of the house where warm light spilled from a ground floor window. Through the glass, Elliot could see a parlor, a small Christmas tree decorated with ribbons, a fire burning in the grate, and beneath the tree, a collection of wrapped presents. They moved closer, keeping to the shadows. From this angle, they could see more clearly. A family scene, a man reading by the fire, a woman doing needlework, the peaceful domesticity of Christmas Eve. And there, among the wrapped packages, one that was exactly the right size and shape. Elliot's breath caught. "Is that it?" Simon whispered, "I think so." They stood in the snow, staring through the window like thieves. The package sat there, wrapped in paper and tied with ribbon, waiting for Christmas morning, waiting for a child to open it with delight. "We could knock again," Simon said quietly. "Offer to buy it back. Offer double what he paid." "On Christmas Eve? After they've wrapped it?" Elliot's voice was hollow. "We'd look like madmen." "You are a madman. That's why we're here. I can't." The words came out rough. "I can't knock on that door and ask them to unwrap their daughter's Christmas present. I can't ruin a child's Christmas to keep your word." "Some things can't be bought, Simon, even with an earl's money." Elliot stepped back from the window. "We're leaving." "Elliot, I said we're leaving." They walked back to the carriage in silence. Elliot climbed in and slumped against the seat, staring at nothing. "You did the right thing," Simon said after a moment. "Did I? Because tomorrow I have to face her and tell her I failed, that I lied, that her grandmother's bird is wrapped under a stranger's tree and there's nothing I can do about it. You could tell her the truth, that you found it but couldn't take it from a child. And she'll understand that I lied to her, that I made a promise I couldn't keep." Elliot laughed bitterly. "No, I'll have lost her anyway." The carriage rolled through the quiet streets. Most of London was asleep now, tucked safe in their homes. Christmas Day was hours away. "What will you do?" Simon asked. "Go to her tomorrow. Tell her the truth. Face whatever comes after. She might forgive you. Why should she?" Elliot stared out at the snow-covered city. "I'm everything she accused me of being. Careless, thoughtless, making promises I can't keep. You searched all of Cheapside in a snowstorm on Christmas Eve. That's not careless. It's not enough." They fell silent. The carriage turned onto Brook Street, nearly home. "For what it's worth," Simon said quietly, "I think she's lucky to have someone care enough to do what you did tonight. She'll never know what I did tonight. Then tell her. It won't change anything. I still don't have the bird." The carriage stopped. Elliot climbed down, every muscle aching with cold and exhaustion and failure. "Get some sleep," Simon said. "Tomorrow will come soon enough." Too soon. Elliot watched the carriage pull away, then turned toward his empty house. Inside, it would be warm, comfortable, all the luxury money could buy. But tomorrow he'd have to face Phoebe Whitmore and admit he'd failed her. Tomorrow he'd watch trust turn to disappointment in those amber eyes. Tomorrow he'd lose her. He climbed the steps slowly, snow crunching under his boots. Behind him, the city lay quiet, waiting for Christmas morning, and Elliot had never dreaded a dawn more in his life. Phoebe woke to pale winter light filtering through her window and one thought filling her mind with startling clarity. Elliot. Not the bird, not Henry's excitement or Christmas dinner or whether the goose would cook properly, just Elliot. She sat up slowly, pressing a hand to her chest where something felt too tight and too full at once. This was absurd. She barely knew him. A few walks, a market trip, an afternoon of music. Hardly the foundation for whatever this feeling was that had taken root in her chest and refused to be reasoned away. From the next room, she heard Henry stirring, then a thump as he tumbled out of bed with his usual lack of grace. "It's Christmas!" His voice carried through the thin walls. "Phoebe! Mama! It's Christmas!" Phoebe dressed quickly and emerged to find her brother already in the main room, practically vibrating with excitement. Cecilia was at the stove, setting the kettle on, looking far too composed for someone who'd just been woken by Henry's enthusiasm. "Happy Christmas, darling," her mother said with a smile. "Happy Christmas, Mama." "When do you think Lord St. Ives will come?" Henry asked, bouncing on his toes. "Do you think he'll bring the bird this morning? Or will he come later? Should we wait to have breakfast in case?" A sharp knock at the door interrupted him. Henry's eyes went wide. "That's him! He's here already." "Henry, it's barely past 7, Cecilia said. "I doubt." But Henry was already at the door, flinging it open. No one stood on the landing. Instead, a package sat on the doorstep, wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. "What is it?" Henry crouched down, examining it. "There's a note." He grabbed the package and the attached card, bringing both inside. His hands shook slightly as he read, "For Master Henry Whitmore, from Father Christmas." "Father Christmas," Henry repeated slowly. Then his face split into a grin. "Father Christmas!" He tore into the paper with abandon. The wrapping fell away to reveal the book, the one he'd been admiring at the bookseller's stall. A natural history of British birds, beautifully illustrated, with gilt edges and a leather binding. "It's the book!" Henry breathed, running his hands over the cover with something like reverence. "The one from the market. But how did Father Christmas know I wanted this exact book?" He looked up at Phoebe with such wonder that her throat went tight. Cecilia moved to the window, looking down at the street. "No one there now," she said quietly. Then, even more quietly, "That was Lord St. Ives's doing, wasn't it? It wasn't really a question." "Yes," Phoebe said. Her mother nodded, unsurprised. "I thought so." She turned back to the stove. "Henry, come show me this magnificent book while I finish the tea." Henry bounded over, already flipping through pages, pointing out illustrations and reading passages aloud. Cecilia made appropriately impressed noises while Phoebe stood frozen by the door. He'd done this. Bought the book, arranged the delivery, made sure Henry would find it on Christmas morning and believe in magic for a little while longer. And he'd done it in secret. Not for credit or gratitude, just because he'd seen a boy admire something he couldn't have and decided to fix it. That was who Elliot St. Ives was when no one was watching. Phoebe moved to the window, looking down at the empty street. Snow from last night still covered everything, pristine and untouched in the early morning light. Somewhere out there, Elliot was. Where? The question hit her suddenly. Where was he this Christmas morning? Did he have family? A mother who expected him at breakfast? Siblings gathering for holiday celebrations? Friends he'd promised to see? She realized with uncomfortable clarity that she had no idea. She knew he was an earl. She knew he lived on Brook Street. She knew he had a friend named Simon and a carriage with a driver named Bennett. She knew he'd bought her grandmother's bird on a whim for a woman he'd been courting. But what did she actually know about him? About his life, his family, his obligations? Had she just assumed he'd spend Christmas Day with them? That he'd appear with the bird and stay for dinner and, what? Become part of their small family celebration as if he had nowhere else to be? How selfish. How presumptuous. He was probably with his own family right now. His own Christmas. Perhaps he'd send the bird with a servant later. Perhaps he wouldn't come at all. Perhaps yesterday's abrupt departure had been exactly what it looked like. A man realizing he'd gotten too entangled with people far beneath his station and making a hasty retreat. You're thinking too much, Cecilia observed, appearing at her elbow with a cup of tea. I'm not thinking at all. You're thinking so loudly I can hear it from across the room. Her mother pressed the warm cup into her hands. He'll come or he won't. Either way, we have a lovely Christmas ahead of us. I know. Do you? Cecilia studied her face. Because you look like you're preparing for disappointment. Phoebe took a sip of tea, not answering. Henry, Cecilia called, come help me with the goose, and bring that beautiful book. You can read me passages while we work. Henry obeyed happily, settling at the table with his prize, while Cecilia began preparations. Their voices filled the small room with warmth and normalcy. And Phoebe stood by the window, watching the street, waiting. The clock on the mantel ticked steadily. 8 o'clock. Then 1/2 past. He wasn't coming. Of course he wasn't coming. Why would he? He'd fulfilled his obligation, or would, when he sent the bird. There was no reason for him to appear in person, to spend Christmas Day in cramped rooms in Bramble Street when he had his own grand house, his own plans, his own life. She'd been a fool to hope otherwise. Phoebe turned away from the window, forcing a smile as Henry read aloud about the migration patterns of starlings. This was enough. Henry's joy, her mother's presence, the warmth of their small home. This was what Christmas was supposed to be. She didn't need a knock at the door. Henry looked up mid-sentence. That's him! That's Lord St. Ives! With the bird. He scrambled up, but Cecilia put a hand on his shoulder. Let your sister answer it. Phoebe's heart was doing something erratic and unhelpful. She smoothed her skirts, took a breath, and opened the door. Elliot St. Ives stood on the landing. Snow dusted his shoulders. His hair was disheveled. Dark circles shadowed his eyes as if he hadn't slept. And his hands were empty, no package, no wrapped bird, no triumphant return of her grandmother's treasure. Just him, looking at her with an expression that made her chest ache. Miss Whitmore, he said quietly. Happy Christmas. May I come in? Behind her she heard Henry's confused voice. Where's the bird? Where indeed? But looking at Elliot's face, at the exhaustion and something that looked like dread, Phoebe realized with sudden crystalline clarity that something had gone very wrong. Of course, she said, stepping back. Please. He entered slowly, as if walking to his own execution. His gaze found Henry, then Cecilia, then returned to Phoebe. I need to tell you something, he said, and you're not going to like it. Chapter 12. Elliot stood in the small parlor of number 14 Bramble Street and tried to find words adequate for what he needed to say. 3 pairs of eyes watched him. Henry, confused and disappointed. Cecilia, calm and assessing. And Phoebe looking at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. I don't understand, Henry said into the silence. Where's the bird? You promised. Henry, Cecilia said quietly, let Lord St. Ives speak. Elliot drew a breath. You're right, I did promise, and I need to tell you what happened. All of it, the truth. He forced himself to meet Phoebe's eyes, to not look away from whatever judgment he'd find there. When I bought the bird from the pawn shop, I intended it as a gift for Lady Clarissa Penholme. I'd been paying her attention. Everyone assumed an offer was imminent. He paused. It wasn't, but I sent her the bird anyway, thinking it would be appropriate. And? Phoebe's voice was carefully neutral. And Lady Clarissa was expecting something else entirely, a proposal, or at the very least, jewelry. When she realized what the bird actually was, a trinket in her eyes, she was furious. He swallowed. She told her maid to dispose of it immediately. Henry made a small sound of distress. The maid didn't throw it away, Elliot continued. She gave it to her cousin, who sold it to a shop in Cheapside, but she didn't know which shop, just that it was somewhere in Cheapside. There are dozens of shops in Cheapside, Phoebe said quietly. I know. He ran a hand through his hair. When I came here yesterday and told you there was a delay with repairs, that was a lie. There was no repair. The bird was already gone, sold to some unknown shop, and I had no idea how to find it. The words hung in the air like an accusation. You lied to me, Phoebe said. Not a question. A statement of fact. Yes, I lied to you. I thought, his voice broke slightly, I thought I could find it before you knew, that I could fix everything, and you'd never have to know I'd lost it in the first place. I was wrong. So where is it now? Henry asked, his voice small. Last night, after I left here, I went to my friend Simon. We went to Cheapside together. Elliot could still feel the cold, could still see the snow falling through the lamplight. Most shops were closed. It's Christmas Eve. Everyone was home with their families. But we kept searching, shop after shop. Most had never seen it. Those that were still open had no idea what we were talking about. He paused, remembering the growing desperation, the cold seeping through his coat, Simon's increasingly pointed commentary. Finally, we found a shopkeeper named Tobias Finch. He remembered the bird, said he'd sold it the day before to a gentleman buying gifts for his daughter. Elliot's throat felt tight. He gave us the man's name and address. We went there immediately, and, Phoebe prompted when he fell silent. And the house was in Mayfair, respectable family. We knocked, but the butler turned us away. It was nearly midnight by then, and they weren't receiving visitors. He forced himself to continue, but we could see through the parlor window. A Christmas tree, wrapped presents underneath. He could still see it, that warm room, that peaceful scene, everything he was about to destroy. One of the packages was the right size, the right shape. He met Phoebe's eyes. I'm almost certain it was the bird, wrapped and waiting for Christmas morning, for a little girl. The silence stretched. So you took it, Henry said hopefully. You got it back and... No. Elliot's voice was rough. I didn't take it. Why not? Henry's confusion was painful to hear. If you knew where it was, because it was wrapped as a child's Christmas present. Elliot looked at the boy. How could I knock on that door in the middle of the night and ask them to unwrap their daughter's gift? How could I ruin a child's Christmas morning to keep a promise I'd already broken by lying? Henry fell silent, clearly struggling to understand. So the bird is gone, Cecilia said quietly. Not a question, an acknowledgement. Yes. Elliot turned back to Phoebe. I failed you. I made a promise I couldn't keep. I lied when I should have told the truth. And now your grandmother's bird, the only thing you had left of her, is under a stranger's Christmas tree, and there's nothing I can do to get it back. Phoebe stood very still. Her face had gone carefully blank, revealing nothing. I'm sorry, he said, the words utterly inadequate. I'm so sorry. I know that doesn't fix anything. I know I've disappointed you. Disappointed Henry. But I needed you to know the truth. I needed you to know I tried. Still, she said nothing. The silence stretched until Elliot thought he might break under the weight of it. He'd lost her. He could see it in her stillness, her careful control. He'd lost her, and he deserved to lose her, and joy must be made, not inherited. The words came so quietly he almost missed them. What? He asked. Joy must be made, not inherited. Phoebe's voice was stronger now. That's what my grandmother wrote, in the letter that came with the bird. I know. His throat felt tight. I'm sorry. I know how much. Wait. She held up a hand, cutting him off. Her eyes had gone sharp, focused. You searched all the shops in Cheapside last night on Christmas Eve? Yes, in the snow, in the cold, when everything was closed. Yes, she took a step toward him. For how long? Hours, I don't know exactly, most of the night. For her voice caught slightly. For me? He couldn't lie to her. Not again, not even to spare himself. Yes, he said simply. For you. Something shifted in her expression, her carefully maintained composure cracking just slightly. And when you found it, when you saw it through that window, you walked away. I had to. It was the right thing to do. Even though it meant breaking your promise to me. Yes, even though it meant losing. She stopped herself. Losing what? He asked quietly. But she didn't answer. Instead, she said, You think you failed? I did fail. The bird is gone. No. Her voice was firm now, certain. You didn't fail, not at all. He stared at her, not understanding. I inherited that bird from my grandmother, Phoebe said. It was the last piece of her I had, the last connection to a past I've been clinging to for 10 years. A past where my father was alive, and we lived in Bloomsbury, and everything was different. I know how much it meant to you. But joy must be made, not inherited, she continued, as if he hadn't spoken. My grandmother knew that. She wrote those words because she understood something I didn't. She took another step closer, close enough now that he could see the gold flecks in her brown eyes, close enough to see that she wasn't angry, wasn't disappointed. She was smiling. I inherited the bird, she said softly, and it brought me joy, but not because of what it was, because of what it did. I don't understand. It brought me to you. The words hung in the air between them. I pawned it to bring Henry home. You bought it. I came to demand it back. You tried to return it. And through all of that, through every mistake and complication and ridiculous moment, it brought me to you. Understanding dawned slowly, like sunrise breaking through clouds. Phoebe, he breathed. The bird is gone, she said. But I'm standing here. You're standing here. And that, her smile widened slightly, that's the joy my grandmother meant, not what we inherit, what we make. He couldn't speak, couldn't find words for what was rising in his chest. Will you stay for Christmas breakfast? She asked, and her voice had gone soft, almost shy. He wanted to laugh, wanted to pull her into his arms, wanted to tell her he'd stay for every breakfast for the rest of their lives if she'd let him. Instead, he smiled, the first real smile since he'd walked away from that window last night. Of course, he said, I would love to. Behind them, Henry made a small sound that might have been relief or confusion or both. Cecilia moved to the stove, suddenly very busy with the kettle, but Elliot could see the smile on her face. And Phoebe was looking at him like he'd given her something far more precious than a mechanical bird, like he'd given her exactly what she'd been hoping for all along. Happy Christmas, Elliot, she said quietly. Happy Christmas, Phoebe. The words felt like a promise, like a beginning. And for the first time since he'd stood outside that house in Mayfair, watching a wrapped present through a window, Elliot felt something close to peace. He hadn't found the bird, but he'd found something infinitely better. We hope you have enjoyed this presentation of The Earl's Christmas Songbird, written by Violet Sinclair, narrated by Isadora Blythe.